Hey, quick question: when you think Victorian era, what do you picture? Pretty dresses, fancy tea parties, maybe some well-mannered ladies sitting around looking graceful. Yeah, we need to talk. Because what was actually happening underneath all those layers of silk and corsets was wild. A society so obsessed with controlling women that it had rules for how they were allowed to look at people, not talk to them, not touch them, just look. Drop a comment right now. Where are you watching this from? I want to know who's here for the deep dive, because we're about to pull back the curtain on one of history's most beautifully disguised cages, and trust me, by the end of this, your jaw will hit the floor. Let's get into it. Let's talk about getting dressed in the morning. For most of us today, it takes somewhere between 5 minutes and a mild identity crisis. You pick something, you put it on, and you go about your day. Maybe you grab a coffee on the way out. Maybe you forget your keys. Normal, forgettable, human stuff. Now imagine that getting dressed took the better part of an hour, required at least one other person's help, involved up to 15 kilograms of layered fabric and hardware pressing against your body, and was considered not an inconvenience but a moral obligation. Imagine that the finished result wasn't just clothing. It was a statement of your character, your family's reputation, your marital status, your social class, and your fundamental worth as a human being. Imagine that doing it wrong, even slightly, could cost you invitations, friendships, and marriage prospects. Welcome to getting dressed in Victorian England. The Victorian era, which ran roughly from 1837 to 1901 under the reign of Queen Victoria herself, was a period of enormous change, industrialization, expanding empires, scientific discoveries, shifting class structures. But while the outside world was transforming at a remarkable pace, the rules governing how a respectable woman was supposed to look remained, if anything, more rigid than ever. The clothing of the period wasn't simply fashion. It was architecture. It was armor. It was a carefully constructed visual argument that the woman wearing it was precisely the kind of person she was supposed to be. And that argument, unfortunately, came with steel boning. To understand why Victorian women dressed the way they did, you have to understand the world they were dressing for. Victorian society operated on an elaborate and largely unspoken system of visual classification. The moment you appeared in public, you were being read by strangers, by neighbours, by acquaintances, by rivals like a document. Every detail of your appearance communicated information about who you were, what you owned, where you came from, and whether you deserved to be taken seriously. Clothing was the primary language of this system, and women bore most of the burden of speaking it correctly. This wasn't entirely unique to the Victorians, of course. Humans have used clothing as a social signal for as long as we've had clothing. But the Victorian period took this tendency and refined it into something almost bureaucratic in its complexity. There were correct fabrics for different times of day. There were correct colours for different social occasions. There were correct silhouettes for different years of the decade, and all of it was expected to be navigated with apparent effortlessness, as though you had simply woken up, reached into your wardrobe, and naturally produced the precisely appropriate ensemble without effort or anxiety. The idea that a woman might find this exhausting was, needless to say, not part of the approved narrative. For women of the middle and upper classes, the women most likely to be scrutinized and most subject to these rules, the day's clothing began long before a single outer garment was put on. It began with the understructure, and the understructure is where things get genuinely architectural. The foundation of the Victorian female silhouette was the corset, and it's worth spending some time here because the corset tends to get either romanticized or catastrophized in equal measure, and the reality is more interesting than either of those versions. Corsets existed long before the Victorian era. Their predecessors date back centuries, but the Victorian corset was a particularly sophisticated piece of engineering. It was constructed from layers of heavy fabric, typically coutil, a tightly woven cotton weave that had about as much give as mild ambition, reinforced with rows of stiff boning. The bone in question was, for much of the period, genuine whalebone, specifically the flexible fibrous baleen plates from the mouths of bowhead and right whales. This material was prized for its combination of stiffness and slight flexibility, its ability to hold a shape while moving with the body. It was also expensive, which is why cheaper corsets used cane, steel, or wood instead. The corset wrapped around the torso from just below the bust to the hips, sometimes lower, and was fastened in the back with lacing and in the front with a rigid busk, a long, flat central panel, often made of steel by the latter part of the century. When properly laced, it compressed the waist, lifted and supported the bust and flattened the stomach. The resulting shape, small waist, lifted chest, smoothed hips was the visual goal, but the mechanism for achieving it involved sustained, significant pressure on the entire midsection for most of the wearer's waking hours. How tight was tight? This is where the historical record gets interesting, because the answer varied enormously depending on who was doing the lacing, what the occasion was, and what decade we're talking about. The image most people have of women being laced into impossibly tiny waists while gripping a bedpost and passing out is largely a product of period caricature and later sensationalism. The average waist reduction from a daily corset was probably more like 2 to 4 inches, not the dramatic 12 or 14 that novelists found more exciting. A 22-inch corseted waist was considered attractive and achieved by a range of women. A 16-inch waist was genuinely unusual and belonged to a much smaller group of people with both the unusual starting measurements and the genuine dedication to severe tight lacing. That said, probably only 2 to 4 inches of compression for most people most of the time is not exactly a ringing endorsement of the practice. Even moderate daily compression had real physiological effects. The lower ribs, the floating ribs, which are only attached to the spine and not the sternum, could be gradually displaced inward with sustained corseting over years. The diaphragm, which sits just above the stomach and is the primary muscle responsible for breathing, was compressed, which reduced lung capacity and meant that Victorian women often genuinely did breathe more shallowly than their uncorseted counterparts. This wasn't entirely accidental. Shallow, gentle breathing was considered feminine. Deep, noisy, chest-heaving breathing was not. The digestive organs also had opinions about being compressed, though they were rarely consulted. Chronic constipation, indigestion, and what contemporary physicians politely called dyspepsia were widespread complaints among corset-wearing women, and the connection between their undergarments and their digestive systems was not always made, or when made, was not necessarily considered sufficient reason to stop wearing the corset. You have to admire, in a slightly appalled way, the commitment to aesthetics over basic organ function. The corset was also not something most women could put on by themselves. The backlacing required either a maid, a family member, or extraordinary contortion. Middle-class women who couldn't afford personal maids developed various workarounds, backlacing systems with cords that could be pulled from the front, for example, but for upper-class women, the daily ritual of corseting was a communal act. The lady's maid was as much a structural engineer as a personal servant, responsible for achieving the right tension across the back, while the wearer gripped something stable and breathed out. Whether this created a sense of vulnerability, intimacy, or just a slightly adversarial working relationship probably varied household by household. Once the corset was in place, the real construction began. The Victorian woman did not simply put on a dress. She assembled an outfit from a series of distinct layers, each with its own purpose, its own rules, and its own contribution to the total weight of the ensemble. The first layer over the corset was typically a chemise, a loose linen or cotton undergarment that protected the more expensive outer clothes from direct contact with the skin and absorbed perspiration. This was a sensible arrangement, given that most Victorian outer garments couldn't be washed easily or frequently without damage. The chemise was usually plain, practical, and entirely invisible. Its job was to exist, not to be interesting. Over the chemise came the stays, which in some discussions refers to the corset itself, but more precisely describes an additional layer of structured support. Then came the petticoat, sometimes one, sometimes several, sometimes an architectural number that staggers modern comprehension. Early Victorian fashion favoured enormous skirt volume, and before the cage crinoline was invented in the 1850s, women achieved this volume through layers upon layers of starched petticoats. At the height of this fashion, a fully dressed woman might be wearing 6 or more petticoats, each adding its own contribution to the circumference and weight of the skirt. A single heavily starched petticoat could weigh over 1 kilogram. Multiply that by several, add the outer skirts on top, and you begin to understand why sitting down was a more complex logistical operation than it sounds. The cage crinoline, introduced in the 1850s, was in its way a genuine innovation, a structural frame of hoops made first from steel or whalebone, and later from a lighter spring steel, designed to support the skirt from below rather than requiring multiple layers of petticoats to create volume. It reduced the weight and bulk of the underpinnings considerably, which women of the period largely appreciated. It did introduce other complications. The cage crinoline in a strong wind had exactly the aerodynamic properties you would expect from a rigid dome under a large fabric sail, which is to say, it behaved badly. Women were occasionally upended by gusts. The cage could tip forward alarmingly on stairs. Sitting down required careful management of the frame, and the diameter of a fashionable crinoline skirt in the mid-1860s could reach approximately 4 to 5 meters at the hem, meaning that a woman occupied a social footprint roughly comparable to a small piece of furniture. Moving through a door required forethought. Sitting in a carriage required negotiation with physics. Navigating a crowded room was an exercise in spatial awareness and social diplomacy simultaneously, because the skirt that extended invisibly to the sides and behind could sweep objects off tables, collide with other people's crinolines in passing, and create small disasters in close quarters. Fires were a genuine hazard. The vast, light fabric of the crinoline could catch an ember from a fireplace or a candle flame in an instant, and burn with alarming speed. This was known, it was documented, it was widely reported, and the crinoline remained fashionable for roughly 20 years, because priorities. The silhouette began to shift in the late 1860s, when the crinoline started to collapse at the front and concentrate volume at the back. This transition led to the era of the bustle, which in its various forms dominated the 1870s and 1880s. The bustle was a structure ranging from a modest pad tied around the waist to an elaborate wire and fabric construction that projected behind the wearer, creating the distinctive silhouette of a skirt that swept dramatically backward. At its most extreme in the late 1880s, the bustle projected so sharply that women were sometimes described as appearing to lean forward into a permanent brace against a wind they alone could feel. The visual effect was striking. The practical experience of sitting down was, again, complicated. A truly substantial bustle required the wearer to essentially perch at the edge of any seat, since the structure projected too far behind to allow sitting back comfortably. The bustle faded in the early 1890s, replaced by the smooth-fronted, full-sleeved silhouette of the mid-decade, which introduced its own structural requirements in the form of sleeve supports wire or fabric pads that held the enormous leg-o-mutton sleeves of the period in their characteristic balloon shape. By the late 1890s, the silhouette was shifting again, toward the S-curve corset that would dominate the Edwardian era, a design that thrust the bust forward and the hips back in a shape that has been described by historians as the swan neck posture, and by anyone who has tried wearing one as extremely inadvisable. The point is that the understructure was never static, never simple, and never without consequences. It changed with fashion, which changed with the decade, which meant that the physical experience of being dressed was a constantly evolving engineering challenge. And all of this was happening before a single outer garment had been put on. The outer garments themselves were, to be fair, often extraordinary. Victorian textile craftsmanship at its best produced clothes of genuine beauty silks that caught the light like water, velvets that absorbed it like shadow, broderie anglaise that looked like patience-made textile. Dressmakers of the period worked with skills that modern fast fashion has largely abandoned, constructing garments through complex pattern cutting, careful hand sewing, and the manipulation of fabric in 3 dimensions that produced shapes no simple commercial pattern could reproduce. But beauty had its own practical complications. Silk, the fabric of choice for formal and evening wear, was both expensive and fragile. It crushed, it spotted, it frayed at edges, and it had a tendency to split along seams under the considerable tension of being worn over a corset and crinoline. The elaborate surface decoration favoured by Victorian fashion, the jet beading, the silk ribbon trim, the lace insets, the velvet piping added weight and complexity, and required careful management to survive in good condition. A ball gown might contain 20 or more meters of silk, plus additional fabric for lining, trimming, and underlining. The total weight of a fully dressed woman in formal evening attire could easily reach 12 to 15 kilograms, most of it hanging from the waist and lower torso. Wearing this weight for an entire evening, standing, walking, dancing, was genuinely physically demanding. The idea that Victorian women were frail is somewhat amusing when set against the evidence of what they were actually carrying on their bodies on a regular basis. The reality was more that they were conditioned to it, in the same way that people who wear heavy work equipment daily stop noticing its weight until they take it off and feel suddenly startlingly light. The maintenance requirements for Victorian clothing were enormous and fell almost entirely on women, either on the women themselves, their maids, or the laundresses and dressmakers they employed. The chemises and other washable linen could be laundered regularly, but the outer garments generally could not. Silk was spot-cleaned, velvet was brushed, wool was aired. Everything was kept in cool, dry conditions, wrapped in tissue or stored in drawers with lavender or camphor against moths. Heavy garments were hung from the waist rather than the shoulders to avoid distortion. Feather trim required special treatment. Jet beading needed careful inspection for damaged threads. The maintenance of a Victorian wardrobe was, effectively, a part-time occupation in itself, and for wealthy women with large wardrobes, a full-time one for the servants responsible for it. The colour of clothing was itself a complex language. Black obviously indicated mourning, with precise gradations from full mourning black to half mourning grey, lavender and white that were strictly codified and communicated the wearer's exact relationship to the deceased and how much time had passed since the death. White was associated with innocence and was the standard for debutantes and brides. Pastels, pale pink, pale blue, soft yellow were considered appropriate for young unmarried women. Richer, deeper colours were appropriate for married women. Bright, saturated colours, vivid scarlet, strong emerald, deep purple required careful judgment about when and how they could be worn without appearing to make too loud a statement. The advent of synthetic aniline dyes in the 1850s and 1860s, invented partly by accident, partly by the relentless Victorian appetite for new technology, introduced an explosion of new colours into fashion: magenta, mauve, vivid greens, striking purples. These chemical dyes produced colours of an intensity previously impossible to achieve and maintain, and they became briefly fashionable with the enthusiasm that greets any genuinely new thing. Some of them were also, as it turned out, mildly toxic. The arsenic-based greens of the period were particularly enthusiastic about causing contact dermatitis and worse, but this was considered a secondary concern relative to their visual impact. When fashion called, health could wait in the anteroom. The social rules around colour extended to fabric as well. Printed cotton, however beautiful, was less prestigious than plain silk. Velvet was ceremonial, not everyday. Lace was an entire status category, unto itself. Handmade lace, particularly Honiton or Brussels lace, was so expensive that a single good lace collar might represent weeks of a skilled craftsperson's work and cost more than a middle-class monthly salary. Machine-made lace, which arrived with industrialization and was visually almost identical to the handmade variety at a fraction of the cost, was technically acceptable, but carried a faint air of the imitation, something that the truly discerning would know about you if they looked closely enough. Whether they were actually looking closely enough was perhaps unclear, but the Victorian relationship to social judgment was best understood as always assume that someone is. Seasonal dressing added another dimension of complexity. The Victorian calendar was not divided simply into warm and cold, it was divided into a series of social seasons, each with its own activities, locations, and associated clothing requirements. The London season ran roughly from spring to midsummer, when Parliament was sitting, and the aristocracy descended on the city for a concentrated period of balls, dinners, presentations at court, and strategic matrimonial manoeuvring. Dressing for the season required a different wardrobe from dressing in the country in autumn, which required different clothes from those needed for Christmas at a country house, which were different again from what was appropriate for a seaside holiday in August. The woman who wanted to participate fully in this social calendar, and for women of a certain class, participation was not entirely optional. It was how marriages were made, and alliances maintained needed not merely one wardrobe but several, each appropriate to its context. A morning dress for receiving calls at home was different from a walking dress for going out, which was different from a carriage dress for being driven in a carriage, which was different from an afternoon tea dress, which was different from a dinner dress, which was different from a ball gown. Each of these categories had its own silhouette, its own appropriate fabric, its own rules about neckline and sleeve length and degree of ornament. A ball gown could show shoulders and a generous décolletage that would be entirely inappropriate on a morning dress. A walking dress could be more plainly ornamented than a dinner dress. Getting these distinctions wrong, even in the direction of overdressing, was a social mistake that said something unflattering about your judgment. The cost of maintaining this kind of wardrobe was substantial, and a significant amount of the economic anxiety of the Victorian middle class was clothing anxiety. The families who could genuinely afford everything that social participation required were wealthy. The vast majority of the middle class, the professional men, the clerks, the small businessmen, the minor gentry were dressing at or beyond the edge of their actual means, or making quiet compromises that they hoped no one noticed. Dresses were made over rather than replaced. Trimmings were changed rather than entire garments. Last season's silhouette was updated with a different sleeve treatment. The appearance of adequate clothing resources was itself a performance, and it was a performance being staged by most of the people watching everyone else's performance, which gives the whole social theatre a pleasantly absurd quality in retrospect. Children's clothing deserves a brief mention here, partly because it illustrates something illuminating about how deeply the Victorian period's social values were literally built into what people wore. Very young children, boys and girls equally, were dressed in much the same way. Loose, comfortable garments that allowed movement and were easy to put on and take off. At around 5 or 6 years old, however, children began to be dressed in clothes that more clearly distinguished their gender and, with it, their social role. Girls were put into scaled-down versions of adult female dress, smaller versions of the pinched waists, the layers, the decorative complexity that would define their wardrobes for the rest of their lives. Boys, by contrast, moved toward clothing that allowed considerably more freedom of movement, and eventually to the loose-limbed comfort of adult male dress. This was not an accident or an oversight. It was an early education. The girl who learned to sit carefully because her dress was fragile, to move with consideration because her skirt was wide, to hold herself upright because her stays didn't allow slouching, she was learning, through the medium of her own clothing, what kind of person she was expected to be. The dress was the first lesson in a very long curriculum. It taught restraint, presentation, physical self-consciousness, the constant awareness of how one appeared to others. By the time she was grown, a well-bred Victorian woman had internalized these lessons so thoroughly that they no longer felt external, they were simply how one moved through the world, which was, presumably, the point. It's tempting to look at all of this and conclude that Victorian women were simply victims of their clothing, passive subjects of a system imposed on them from outside. The reality is more complicated and, in some ways, more interesting. Many women of the period genuinely liked their clothes. They appreciated the beauty of the materials, the skill of the construction, the way that fashionable dress allowed for individual expression within a shared visual language. Correspondence and diaries of the period show women engaging enthusiastically with fashion, discussing new styles with pleasure, taking pride in well-made garments, collaborating with dressmakers to achieve exactly the effect they wanted. The relationship between Victorian women and their clothing was, in other words, roughly what the relationship between women and their clothing has usually been. Complicated, personal, variable, not reducible to a simple story about oppression or enthusiasm alone. The same corset that one woman experienced as a physical constraint was for another woman a familiar and unremarkable part of her daily dressing routine, no more remarkable than tying shoes. The same social rules that felt punishingly restrictive to a woman who wanted to live differently were, for a woman whose ambitions fit comfortably within the available social space, simply the rules of the game she was playing. What's more interesting is the space between complicity and constraint, the ways in which individual women navigated the requirements of dress for their own purposes. A woman who understood the visual language of Victorian clothing could use it strategically. The dress that communicated exactly the right level of prosperity, not so much as to suggest pretension, not so little as to suggest decline, was a tool for maintaining a specific social position. The morning dress worn perfectly, exactly when and for exactly as long as propriety required, communicated an impeccable moral character. The fashionable gown that showed taste without ostentation said something different from the gown that was fashionable to the point of excess. Women who were skilled at this language were not simply obeying it, they were speaking it, actively shaping how they were read by the people around them. This is not the same as freedom. It's important to be clear about that. The ability to use a set of rules skillfully is not the same as having the power to change or refuse those rules. The woman who navigated the visual codes of Victorian dress most brilliantly was still, ultimately, navigating them. The system required her compliance as the price of social participation, and whatever individual agency she exercised within it didn't alter the fact that the system itself extracted a real cost in discomfort, in time, in money, in the constant work of presenting a self that met someone else's specifications. But skill and agency within constraint are still worth acknowledging, because the alternative narrative, the one in which Victorian women were simply dressed by a hostile world and had no relationship to their own clothes except suffering, erases something real about how humans actually live in the systems they inhabit. The factories that produced Victorian clothing are worth a moment of consideration, because the garment trade tells a complementary story about how clothing worked as a social system. The wealthy woman with her fashionable wardrobe was the visible end of a supply chain that extended through several layers of increasingly invisible and decreasingly comfortable labour. Dressmakers who worked directly for wealthy clients occupied a slightly ambiguous social position. Skilled professionals who were treated as tradespeople received in a context that was neither quite the front door nor quite the servant's entrance, compensated for extraordinary skill at rates that rarely reflected the actual value of their work. The finest couturiers of London and Paris commanded real status and real money, but they were unusual. The ordinary dressmaker or seamstress worked long hours for modest pay, doing extremely skilled work in conditions that ranged from reasonably comfortable to genuinely bad. Below the individual dressmakers were the outworkers women who worked at home, taking in piecework to sew for the garment trade. These women completed specific parts of garments hemming, buttonhole making, trimming, basting for payment that was calculated by the piece and worked out to very little per hour when the actual time required was accounted for. Charles Dickens and other contemporaries wrote about the conditions of these women with varying degrees of accuracy and melodrama, but the basic picture was accurate. The women at the bottom of the fashion supply chain were working very hard to produce clothing they could not afford to wear, so that women at the top of the social scale could wear clothing that demonstrated they did not need to work. This irony was noted at the time. Reform movements that emerged in the Victorian period to argue for better conditions for working women often used the garment trade as a central example, precisely because the visual contrast was so sharp and so legible. The silk that draped a duchess had been hemmed by a woman in a cold room working by failing candlelight. Victorian society was not entirely unaware of this. It was simply, for much of the period, considered the natural order of things. Toward the end of the Victorian era, small but significant challenges to the dominant clothing system began to appear. The rational dress movement, emerging in the 1880s, argued that women's clothing should be designed around health and practicality rather than fashion and social performance. Advocates for rational dress argued against tight lacing, against excessive weight in skirts, against the physical constraints that contemporary fashion imposed on women's movement and health. They promoted alternatives, looser bodices, divided skirts, clothing that allowed genuine physical activity. The rational dress movement was met with a range of responses, from serious intellectual engagement to amused contempt. Cartoons in humour magazines depicted women in reform dress as mannish, ludicrous, unfeminine. Medical opinion was divided. Some physicians supported the movement's critique of tight lacing. Others maintained that moderate corseting was harmless or even beneficial. Society hostesses were generally unenthusiastic. The women who actually wore rational dress in public were required to be fairly indifferent to social disapproval, which was itself a form of selection effect that limited the movement's reach. The bicycle, which became enormously popular in the 1890s, did more for practical dress reform than any number of reform pamphlets. Cycling in a heavy skirt over a crinoline was quite simply impossible, and the women who wanted to cycle, and there were a lot of them, because the bicycle represented something genuinely transformative in terms of independent mobility, had to adapt their clothing accordingly. The bloomer, a bifurcated garment that allowed leg movement, was revived for cycling, and while it still caused controversy, the simple practical argument that you could not ride a bicycle in a bustle was difficult to argue with. Practicality, in the end, is a more powerful force than etiquette. Physical activity more generally began to create exceptions to the dominant dress rules. Tennis, which became fashionable among women in the latter part of the period, required clothing that allowed arm movement. Country walking required sensible shoes and shorter skirts. Swimming required an entirely specialized costume. In each case, the space of the activity created a temporary exemption from the standard rules and acknowledgement, even if a narrow one, that there were things the dominant silhouette couldn't do. These exceptions were small, and they didn't immediately transform the overall system. The corset wasn't abandoned in the Victorian era, it persisted well into the 20th century. The social reading of women's clothing didn't stop when Victoria died. But the cracks were appearing, and the logic that underpinned the whole structure that a woman's primary obligation was to present herself as a certain kind of person, defined by others, displayed through her clothing at a cost to her health, and movement was beginning to come under real pressure. What's striking, looking at the whole Victorian clothing system from this distance, is how much of it was invisible infrastructure. The women who moved through Victorian society in their elaborate dress didn't think I am wearing a system of social control. They thought about whether their corset was too tight, whether the colour of their trim was right for the occasion, whether their newest dress was going to work for both the afternoon visit and the dinner that followed it. The constraints were real, but they were lived from the inside, not contemplated from the outside. This is true of most social systems. The rules that structure a society's behaviour are usually most powerful when they're most invisible, when they've been absorbed into habit and expectation so thoroughly that they don't feel like rules anymore, just the way things are. The Victorian woman who laced her corset every morning wasn't, in most cases, consciously thinking about the ideology of femininity. She was just getting dressed. The fact that getting dressed was itself a comprehensive act of social compliance was a structural feature that operated largely below the level of individual awareness. And yet, and this is where it gets genuinely interesting, awareness did exist. Women of the period wrote about their clothing, complained about its inconveniences, discussed its demands. The reform movements were not made up of people who had failed to notice that their clothes were constraining. They were made up of people who had noticed and decided to say so out loud, which is a different thing. The question wasn't whether Victorian women knew they were wearing a lot of clothing. Obviously they knew. The question was how they understood that fact, what framework they had for interpreting it, and what options they believed were available to them. The options were limited, which is precisely why the stories of individual resistance and creativity within the system are worth telling. The woman who found a way to be comfortable, to move more freely, to use her clothing for her own purposes rather than only for others' reading, she was working with the same constraints as everyone around her, and doing something different with them. That deserves attention. Because if the Victorian dress code demonstrates anything, it's that the relationship between what we wear and who we're allowed to be is never simple, never just decorative, and never as benign as it looks. The weight of 15 kilograms of silk and steel boning was not metaphorical, it was entirely literal. And understanding that weight, what it meant, who decided it was necessary and who paid the physical and social price of wearing it, is essential to understanding the world those women lived in. The dress was not just a dress. It was, in almost every sense that matters, the world. We've already established that the Victorian woman wore somewhere in the region of 15 kilograms of clothing on a daily basis, that this clothing was structurally engineered to compress, support, and constrain, and that getting dressed required both a support person and a working knowledge of social semiotics, all of which might lead you to assume that, given the sheer quantity of fabric involved, the question of what was and wasn't visible would be fairly settled. Everything was covered, problem solved, move on, you would be wrong. Because in Victorian England, the coverage of the female body was not simply a matter of how much fabric was present, it was a question of which parts of the body that fabric was covering, and what moral significance was assigned to each square inch of skin. And nowhere was this more vivid, more culturally loaded or more genuinely bizarre to modern eyes than in the extraordinary status of the ankle. The female ankle, in Victorian England, was not simply a joint connecting the foot to the lower leg. It was a charged object, a flashpoint, a piece of anatomy so weighted with implication that its accidental revelation could trigger genuine social consequences, the kind that would follow a woman for months, be discussed at dinner tables she wasn't present at, and appear, subtly, in the cooling of formerly warm invitations. The ankle was not just an ankle. It was a symbol of everything the Victorian propriety system was trying to manage, and the rules around its visibility tell us something precise and fascinating about how that system actually worked. Let's establish the geography first, because it matters. The Victorian modesty code was not simply cover everything, it was more specifically about what counted as charged territory versus what was contextually acceptable. The neck and upper chest, for instance, were largely acceptable in the right circumstances. A low-cut evening gown was entirely proper for a formal ball or dinner, and a woman with good shoulders and the right dress was expected to display them in exactly that context. The arms could be bare in evening dress. The back, sometimes substantially bare, was appropriate at formal occasions. These were understood, within the visual logic of the period, as parts of the body that could be displayed when the occasion sanctioned it. The ankle, however, was in a different category entirely. It was intimate in a way that the décolletage at a ball was not, which is the kind of sentence that requires a moment to sit with before moving on. The logic behind this asymmetry was not, strictly speaking, logical in any way that a person from a different cultural context would immediately recognise. It operated according to a set of associations and anxieties that were specific to the period, and understanding those associations requires understanding something about how the Victorian mind organised the female body. The upper body, in formal dress contexts, was on display in a controlled, ritualised way. The ball gown's neckline was as much a part of the structured social performance as the dancing itself, governed by rules about when it was appropriate and worn in spaces where its presence was expected. The lower body, by contrast, was always, under all circumstances, covered. The skirts that swept the ground were not an aesthetic choice alone, they were a structural boundary. The lower half of a woman was invisible by definition, by default, by rule. That boundary was so consistently maintained that any violation of it, however small, however accidental, became charged with significance precisely because the rule was never broken. This is a phenomenon that appears throughout the history of dress. The parts of the body that are most consistently covered acquire the greatest erotic and social charge when glimpsed, because their concealment has made them into something exceptional. In a culture where the lower female body was categorically invisible, the ankle was the border, the last visible station before the territory that was never shown. To catch a glimpse of it was to be unexpectedly close to a line that was never supposed to be crossed. And this is why a single gust of wind on a London street in 1875 was not simply a meteorological event. It was a small social emergency. The dresses women wore to prevent exactly this kind of emergency were, to put it gently, not optimised for practical movement. We've already discussed the weight and volume of Victorian skirts, the layers, the structures, the sweeping circumference. But the specific design feature that addressed ankle visibility was the train, the extension of the skirt's back hem that dragged along the ground behind the wearer, ensuring that at no point, at no angle, under no wind conditions could the foot or lower leg be inadvertently glimpsed. A well-made walking dress of the period didn't just reach the ground, it exceeded it, creating a fabric margin of safety that moved behind the woman like a cautious chaperone made of silk. The train was not universally practical, as you might imagine. It picked up everything from the ground, which in Victorian London included a range of substances that are unpleasant to enumerate. Women who walked outdoors with trained skirts accumulated on the hem of their dress, a daily collection of street material that required systematic cleaning. There were specific servants whose job it was to deal with train hems. There were products marketed specifically for this purpose. The fashion industry's solution to the inconvenience of the train was not to shorten the train, but to develop better methods of cleaning it, which tells you something about the priorities involved. The train was also, in crowded indoor spaces, a hazard to navigation. It could be stepped on by the person walking behind you, which was both uncomfortable and undignified. It could catch on furniture. It could be accidentally claimed by someone sitting down too close. In a room full of women with trains, the floor was, effectively, continuously carpeted with extended skirt fabric, and moving through it required a kind of spatial awareness that modern life simply doesn't demand. Women learned to flip the train with a practiced flick of the wrist when turning, to manage it on stairs, to bunch it up when necessary. This was a skill, and like all skills required in the service of a fashion convention, it was treated as entirely natural rather than as evidence that the convention might be slightly inconvenient. For more active outdoor walking, genuine walking, not the measured social promenade, the problem of the floor-length hem had been addressed, earlier in the period by the invention of the dress holder, or skirt lifter. This was a small clip device, available in various forms throughout the second half of the century. that allowed a woman to gather the front and sides of her skirt and hold them slightly elevated, perhaps an inch or two above the pavement while walking. This prevented the worst of the mud and street accumulation while preserving coverage. The use of the dress holder was itself governed by etiquette. It was appropriate for practical walking on uneven or dirty surfaces, but using it on a clean, dry street was considered slightly lower class, as though you were admitting that you had somewhere to get to rather than simply gliding through space with no particular destination, as proper ladies apparently did. Even with a dress holder, the visibility permitted was minimal, a glimpse of the shoe's toe, perhaps a quarter inch of stocking above it. The actual ankle remained invisible. The actual ankle was, throughout the entirety of mainstream Victorian fashion, essentially theoretical for anyone who encountered a properly dressed woman in public, which makes the response to accidental ankle visibility all the more remarkable. Contemporary accounts and the etiquette literature of the period are consistent on the point. A glimpse of ankle, in circumstances where it wasn't supposed to occur, was noted, it was remembered. It generated precisely the kind of comment that a woman did not want generated about her appearance. Not because the ankle itself was shocking, in any objective sense, but because its visibility indicated a failure of management, a lapse in the constant, vigilant control of the self-presentation that a respectable woman was expected to maintain. The scandal of the ankle was not really about the ankle, it was about control. A woman who allowed her ankle to be seen had failed to manage her presentation. The failure might have been weather-related, perfectly innocent, entirely outside her control. None of that mattered. The result was the same. She'd been seen in a state that was outside the approved parameters, and that deviance from the visual code registered as a failure of personal discipline. In a society that read female character through female presentation, a lapse in presentation was, by implication, a lapse in character. This is why the same woman who could display her shoulders and upper chest at a ball without any particular social consequence was vulnerable to significant social commentary if her ankle appeared unexpectedly on a street. The ball was a controlled environment with established rules. The décolletage was permitted within those rules and therefore carried no charge of impropriety. The ankle on the street was a violation of a code that was supposed to be inviolable, and the violation registered regardless of how it happened. The context determined the meaning, and in the context of public outdoor space, the lower body was supposed to be invisible. The anxiety about ankle visibility also extended into posture and movement in ways that shaped how Victorian women occupied physical space. Sitting down, for instance, was a carefully managed operation. The simple act of lowering oneself onto a seat required that the skirts be arranged both before and during the movement to ensure that no hem lifted, no foot became visible at an angle, no portion of the lower leg was momentarily exposed in the transition from standing to seated. Women practiced this. The smooth, apparently effortless, actually quite deliberate act of sitting down without revealing anything below the knee was as much a cultivated social skill as table manners or conversational topics. Staircases were another particular challenge. Walking up a staircase, the hem of a long skirt had to be managed precisely lifted enough at the front to prevent stepping on it, but not so much as to raise it to visibility. Walking down was slightly different, requiring a more delicate balance of control at the sides, while keeping the back hem from dragging on the steps. Etiquette manuals addressed this. Finishing schools included it. The mechanics of stair navigation in a full Victorian skirt was a specific competency that girls acquired in the same way they acquired other social competencies, by watching, practicing, and being corrected when they got it wrong. Carriages introduced yet another scenario. Getting into a carriage required a step up and a pivot, both of which created conditions for hem management failures if not properly executed. Getting out required the reverse, with the additional complication that one was typically being assisted by a footman or coachman who was standing below and would have an unavoidable sightline toward the step if anything went wrong. Women developed characteristic techniques for managing these transitions, a particular way of gathering the skirt from the side rather than the front before stepping, a specific posture for the step-up that minimized the lift of the back hem. The amount of cognitive bandwidth devoted to the continuous management of hem visibility is, from a modern perspective, somewhat staggering. We live in a time when the question of whether your ankle is visible carries approximately zero social significance, and the cognitive space that previously would have been devoted to managing that visibility is available for other things. Whether this represents an improvement in the human condition is, technically, a philosophical question, but the answer seems fairly clear. The décolletage paradox, the fact that the same social system that treated a glimpsed ankle as a minor crisis, permitted, and indeed expected, a significant display of upper chest at formal occasions is worth dwelling on, because it illuminates something important about how the Victorian modesty code actually functioned. Formal evening dress for women was, in terms of skin exposure, quite revealing by the standards of any other context. A good ball gown of the 1870s or 1880s could feature a neckline that exposed the upper chest, the shoulders, and a substantial portion of the upper back. This was not considered immodest. It was considered appropriate specifically, appropriate to the context. The ballroom was a controlled environment, with a specific social function, attended by people of a certain class and relationship to one another, in a defined and supervised social setting. Within that context, the display of the upper body was sanctioned and unremarkable. The lower body, in contrast, had no context in which its display was sanctioned. There was no occasion, no location, no social setting in which seeing a Victorian woman's ankle was appropriate. The asymmetry wasn't about which body parts were considered more or less significant in the abstract. It was about which parts of the body had licensed context for visibility, and which didn't. Upper body exposure had a licensed context, formal evening entertainment. Lower body exposure had none. This made the lower body paradoxically more charged than the upper body in most circumstances. The neckline at a ball was expected. The ankle on the street was a transgression, not because ankles were more scandalous than shoulders in any purely anatomical sense. They clearly aren't, but because the ankle had no license, and the shoulder at a ball did. The Victorian modesty code was a system of contextual permissions, not a simple hierarchy of body parts. Understanding this helps explain a lot of behaviours that otherwise seem contradictory. Why could women wear somewhat translucent fabrics for evening wear, but were expected to cover their lower legs completely at all times? Why were bare arms acceptable at a dinner party but bare feet at the seaside, even in the same era and social class, a more complicated matter? Because the permissions were contextual. The same body could be more or less visible depending on where it was and what occasion had sanctioned what kind of display. The rules weren't about the body, they were about the context in which the body could appear, and who had the authority to define those contexts. The seaside deserves its own moment here, because it was one of the great wild cards of the Victorian modesty landscape. The sea bathing tradition, which became popular among the middle and upper classes in the second half of the 19th century partly for genuine health reasons, and partly because everyone needed somewhere to go in August, created a specific challenge for the modesty code, the obvious practical impossibility of swimming in the same garments one wore for everything else. Victorian bathing costumes were, to put it charitably, a compromise. They covered most of the body, typically a loose knee-length dress-like garment in dark wool, with long sleeves and sometimes a small cap, worn over full-length drawers and stockings. The fabric was heavy when wet, which meant that sea bathing in the proper costume was essentially a full-body resistance workout combined with a slight drowning risk. The bathing costume for women covered from neck to ankle, and was designed to become as opaque as possible when wet, which dark wool does achieve while also becoming approximately twice as heavy. The system of bathing machines wheeled changing rooms pulled by horses into the sea, so that a woman could descend directly into the water from an enclosed structure without being seen walking across the beach in her bathing costume, was the Victorian engineering solution to the problem of public modesty, in a context that required partial undress. A woman would enter the bathing machine on dry land, fully dressed, change inside and descend into the sea directly from the machine steps. After bathing, she would climb back in, change again, and emerge on dry land in her street clothing. She never needed to be seen in her bathing costume on the open beach. At the height of their use, bathing machines were attended by a dipper, typically a large and cheerful woman whose job was to assist the bather into the water and, if necessary, dunk her beneath the waves. The therapeutic value of sea bathing was considered to be linked to full immersion, which some bathers required encouragement to achieve. The dipper was one of those Victorian occupations that sounds, from a distance, almost satirical but was entirely real. She was paid for her services, had regular clients, and was in some seaside towns a well-known local character. Whether she found the work spiritually fulfilling is unrecorded. The contrast between the concealment mechanisms on the beach and the relatively liberal dress conventions at a formal ball illustrates again how the permission system worked. The beach was a public space where bodies were physically exposed in ways that had no equivalent in ordinary social life, and this created an anxious need for management and control. The ballroom was a controlled social environment where the conventions around display were established and understood. The beach was formless and exposed. The ballroom was contained and supervised. The modesty code responded accordingly, with maximum anxiety and maximum concealment at the beach, and relative latitude in the supervised social setting. It's worth noting, as a brief calibration of the whole ankle situation, that the sensitivity around lower body visibility was not constant across the period. It was most intense in the middle decades of the Victorian era, the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s, and began to relax somewhat toward the end of the century, as hemlines crept a little higher, still floor length by modern standards but measurably less floor sweeping, and as the practical demands of physical activity created more accepted exceptions. By the 1890s, the woman cycling in bloomers was a visible figure in public life, even if a controversial one, and the absolute rule of ankle invisibility was under at least some pressure. But for the majority of the period, and certainly for any woman who cared about maintaining a respectable social position in middle or upper-class society, the management of lower body visibility was a daily ongoing physical practice, as much a part of the day's work as anything else she did. If the management of the body's visibility was a constant physical practice, the management of vision itself, of where one directed one's eyes, how one held one's gaze, what one appeared to see, and what one gave no indication of having noticed, was an equally demanding social discipline, and it operated in a world without sunglasses, which means there was no easy technological solution. Victorian etiquette around the gaze was specific, detailed, and written down. This is one of the more charming features of the Victorian period. It had a robust publishing industry dedicated to explaining social rules that people were supposed to have already absorbed through upbringing and observation, which suggests either that a lot of people hadn't absorbed them, or that the act of writing them down served a social function beyond simple instruction. Possibly both. The etiquette manuals of the period covered everything from how to write a letter of condolence to the correct order of precedence at a dinner table, but they also addressed, with surprising specificity, the mechanics of visual interaction, who could look at whom, under what circumstances, for how long, and what various configurations of looking were understood to mean. The foundational principle was asymmetry. Looking was not a neutral act performed equally by all parties. It was socially charged in ways that depended on who was looking and who was being looked at, in what context, with what apparent intention, and for how long. A look that was entirely acceptable from one party could be an impertinence from another. A gaze that was permissible in one setting became offensive in a different one. Navigating this system required a working knowledge of the social variables involved and the capacity to perform one's own visual behaviour with sufficient control that it always communicated the right thing and never accidentally communicated something that could be mistaken for the wrong thing. For women, the stakes were higher than for men in almost every scenario, because the social consequences of getting it wrong fell more heavily on them. A woman who made eye contact too freely with strangers risked being categorised as a particular kind of woman, one whose willingness to acknowledge unknown men suggested an openness to interaction that respectable women were supposed to avoid signalling. The logic was circular in the way that a lot of Victorian social logic was circular. A respectable woman didn't make eye contact with strangers because only disreputable women did that, and the practice of respectable women avoiding it maintained the signal value of the behaviour. Whether the woman in question was actually open to interaction was almost beside the point. The signal mattered more than the underlying reality, because in a system where reputation was everything, and reputation was constructed from visible behaviour, the behaviour was the reality. Etiquette manuals of the period described several distinct categories of gaze behaviour and their associated meanings with a precision that suggests the authors had given the matter genuine thought. The downward gaze eyes directed at the ground or at one's own hands when in the company of unfamiliar men communicated modesty, propriety, and the absence of improper intent. This was the safe default for public situations, though it had to be maintained with a certain natural ease rather than an artificial rigidity, or it came across as studied rather than genuine. There was apparently a wrong way to look at the ground. The forward gaze eyes directed ahead, at the level of the horizon or slightly below it was more ambiguous. In the right circumstances, it communicated composure and dignity. In the wrong circumstances, or held slightly too long in the direction of a man, it could read as forwardness. The forward gaze was available to women as a posture of composed indifference, but it required careful management of where exactly forward pointed, because forward and directly at a stranger could be hard to distinguish from outside. Meeting someone's eyes, directly sustained eye contact was the most fraught territory. Between women, eye contact was fairly straightforward and could be read as attention, interest, or warmth in the usual ways. Between a woman and a man she knew, eye contact was acceptable within the context of a conversation and the established relationship between them, calibrated to the formality of the situation and the nature of the acquaintance. Between a woman and an unknown man in public, sustained eye contact was a near-universal social error, or rather, a near-universal signal that the woman in question had stepped outside the boundaries of respectable female behaviour. The manuals were not unaware of the practical problems this created. How does one navigate a crowded street while keeping one's eyes appropriately averted without walking into people? How does one move through a social gathering without appearing to look at anyone in particular, while also appearing socially engaged and aware? The answers to these questions involved a vocabulary of controlled peripheral vision, of glances that scanned without apparently scanning, of social attention that was active but appeared passive. This is, when you describe it plainly, a fairly sophisticated set of perceptual skills, the ability to take in your environment fully, while giving no obvious indication of having done so. Walking in public was where these skills were most visibly and continuously required. The public street was an uncontrolled social environment full of strangers, which meant it was a space where the rules of the gaze applied constantly, and without the management that a structured social occasion would provide. A woman on her own, or with a companion, since, as we'll discuss shortly, being on one's own was itself a problem, was navigating a continuous stream of potential social interactions, each of which had to be managed correctly, each of which required real-time judgment about who was present, what the appropriate gaze posture was, and whether adjustments needed to be made. A woman passing a man she knew slightly on the street had options, each with different implications. She could look up, make brief eye contact, and nod a minimal acknowledgement that indicated recognition and propriety, without inviting conversation. She could look slightly past him, a practice social near miss that allowed both parties to pretend, if necessary, that recognition hadn't occurred, and was available as a graceful exit from interactions that one party wished to avoid. She could look down entirely, which risked appearing rude to someone who expected to be acknowledged but served as a reliable signal of the desire not to engage. The choice between these options depended on the nature of the relationship, the context of the encounter, who else was observing, and what the social consequences of each choice might be. The man who was acknowledged with a nod would interpret it one way. The same nod from a woman of ambiguous social standing might be interpreted differently. The near miss was safer when in doubt but could give offence if the relationship warranted acknowledgement. The downward gaze was always safe in terms of propriety, but required the other party to accept being not seen, which not everyone accepted gracefully. This is a lot of calculation for walking down a street, and it's worth noting that all of it was supposed to be invisible, performed so smoothly and so naturally that it appeared to be happening without effort or thought. A woman whose navigation of public space appeared deliberate or anxious was already communicating something that she probably didn't want to communicate. The art was in making the performance look like the absence of performance. The act of looking at physical spaces, at shop windows, at buildings, at the general visual environment of the city was itself regulated in ways that had a specific class and gender character. A woman of good family who stared openly at shop windows, pressing close to the glass and examining the displays with obvious interest, was communicating a consumerist eagerness that was considered slightly unbecoming. The approved posture was one of mild, passing interest, a glance, a slight inclination toward the window, a movement on. Lingering too long suggested either that you had too much time available or that you were making plans you should have been able to make without such extended study, implying that the prices and products were things you needed to think carefully about, which implied financial considerations that one preferred not to appear to have. This is the kind of rule that looks, at first glance, absurd, but it reflects a genuine social logic about what kinds of relationship to material life and commerce were appropriate for women of a certain class to display. A lady was not supposed to appear to want things too obviously. She was supposed to have what she needed, to acquire what was appropriate, but without the visible urgency of desire or the visible effort of economizing. To look too long and too hard at a shop window was to expose something about your interior relationship to the world of goods that the proprieties required you to keep private. The rules about looking in social settings at parties, dinners, and gatherings were different from those for public outdoor spaces, but equally specific. In a social setting with established guests, there was more latitude for observation, but it was still governed by what and how you appeared to notice. Looking at another woman's dress too closely and too obviously was a double-edged act. It could be read as admiration, but it could equally be read as criticism, or as the kind of inventory-taking that implied competitive surveillance. The socially graceful thing was to observe widely, absorb comprehensively, and appear to be doing neither to have clearly taken in the room without appearing to have studied it. Looking at a man who was not your husband, father, or close male relative required particular care in social settings. The etiquette around this was not merely about the duration of the look, but about its quality. There was a recognized difference between the general gaze of social awareness and the specific gaze of interest, and women were expected to stay firmly on the general side of that distinction, regardless of what they actually thought about the person in question. A woman who was observed looking at a particular man more than the circumstances warranted was generating a narrative about herself that she hadn't authorized. This is one of the features of a reputation-based social system. Once the narrative exists, it exists whether or not it's true, and its existence is as consequential as its truth. The looking glass, the mirror, had its own complex relationship to Victorian gaze etiquette. Mirrors were everywhere in Victorian interiors, and the ability to use them discreetly for social surveillance was a recognized social skill. A woman seated with her back to a portion of the room she was supposed to be ignoring could, with a well-positioned mirror, maintain full awareness of what was happening behind her without appearing to turn around. This wasn't considered deceptive, it was considered competent social management. The mirror was a tool for maintaining the performance of inattention, while actually attending quite carefully. Looking at oneself in public, checking one's appearance in shop windows used as inadvertent mirrors, using a compact at the table was also governed by rules about how much self-attention was appropriate to display. A woman who was obviously and repeatedly checking her reflection communicated a vanity that was considered unbecoming. A woman who apparently never looked at her reflection, but was always perfectly presented, communicated the ideal, the appearance of effortlessness that required continuous effort to maintain. The goal was not actually to be indifferent to one's appearance. The entire Victorian dress system required intense and detailed attention to appearance, but to appear indifferent, or at least not desperately attentive. The opera glass, lorgnette, and similar instruments deserve specific mention because they represent one of the more entertainingly paradoxical elements of the Victorian visual landscape. The lorgnette was a pair of eyeglasses on a handle, held up to the eyes when needed and lowered when not in use, and it was a fashionable accessory throughout the period, particularly among older women and those who could carry off the slightly imperious quality it conveyed. Its social function was both practical and performative. The practical function was obvious. It allowed a person to see things at a distance more clearly. The performative function was more interesting. Directing a lorgnette at someone was, in the right circumstances, an act of considered examination that communicated social power. The holder of the lorgnette was explicitly and deliberately looking, claiming the right to examine, making no pretense of the visual indirection that was otherwise expected. An older woman of established social standing who turned her lorgnette on a new arrival to a social gathering was performing a kind of official inspection, and the new arrival who received this scrutiny was expected to stand still and accept it without visible discomfort, because the alternative was to appear to have something to hide. For younger women, this kind of explicit, extended looking was generally not available. It would have read as impertinence rather than authority. The lorgnette in the hands of someone without the social standing to sustain its implications was simply rude. The same visual behaviour that was imperious authority in one hand was bad manners in another, which is a neat illustration of how much Victorian social rules depended on the identity of the person performing them. The rules were rarely truly universal. They were calibrated to who was doing what to whom. The opera glass used at the theatre and opera primarily occupied a slightly different position, because it was a licensed tool for looking. At a performance, looking at the stage was obviously the entire point, and the opera glass was a legitimate aid. But opera glasses in Victorian theatres were also used to look at other audience members, particularly across the auditorium, and this mutual surveillance was understood as part of the social experience of attending a performance. Going to the opera was, for the Victorian upper classes, at least as much about being seen as about hearing the music, and the theatre provided a structure in which looking at people was acceptable in ways that it wasn't in most other contexts. You were displayed, they looked. You looked, they were displayed. Everyone was simultaneously observer and observed, and the opera glass was the instrument that made this double experience explicit. The cumulative effect of all these gaze rules, the management of where one looked, for how long, with what apparent intention, from what social position was to make every social interaction a performance with a technical dimension. This wasn't unique to the Victorians. All human social life has an element of managed performance. But the Victorian period, with its elaborate written codification of social rules and its intense investment in the social reading of behaviour, made the technical demands unusually explicit and unusually consequential. For women in particular, the gaze rules were another layer of the continuous management of self-presentation that we've already seen at work in the clothing system. Just as the dress had to communicate the right things, the eyes had to communicate the right things. Just as the hem had to be at the right level, the gaze had to be at the right angle. The body, in all its aspects, was a text being read by an audience, and the rules governing each part of that text were specific, consistent, and enforced by social consequence. One of the interesting things about these rules, from a present-day perspective, is how exhausting they must have been to maintain continuously. The Victorian woman walking down a street wasn't just managing her physical presentation, the weight of her clothing, the width of her skirt, the height of her hem. She was simultaneously managing her visual output, her apparent line of sight, her social acknowledgement of passing acquaintances, her relationship to shop windows, her response to strangers. All of this at once, in real time, in a space that provided no margin for error, and a social environment that was, by design, paying close attention. The word performance keeps appearing in discussions of Victorian social life, and it's the right word, but it has to be understood in a specific way. It wasn't performance in the sense of pretense of acting out something one didn't feel or believe. For most women in the period, the social rules were genuinely internalized. The performance was, in a deep sense, real. But it was performance in the theatrical sense of a presentation that required technique, practice, and ongoing attention, a production that was always running and never had an intermission. The gaze, in this context, was not just about where the eyes pointed. It was about what kind of person one was, and whether one was successfully communicating that in every moment of every public appearance. The downward look on the street, the carefully managed periphery in a crowd, the brief correct nod to an acquaintance, the interest not shown in the shop window, the self not quite examined in the glass, all of it added up to a coherent message. I am exactly the kind of woman I am supposed to be. Whether that was a comfortable message to deliver in every moment indefinitely is a different question. But it was the message the system required. And for most Victorian women in the middle and upper classes, it was the message they spent a significant portion of their waking lives constructing. Every single day, without sunglasses. We've established across the last few chapters that Victorian women operated inside a world of continuous layered performance, managing their clothing, their gaze, their posture, and the carefully calibrated messages their physical presentation sent to everyone around them. Every detail communicated something. Every social interaction required real-time interpretation of codes that were widely understood but rarely spoken aloud. The body was a text being read by an audience that never stopped reading. And yet, in the middle of all this surveillance, all this visibility, all this enforced transparency, Victorian women found a way to conduct entire conversations that were completely invisible to the people standing next to them. Not through whispers, not through folded notes, not through anything an alert chaperone or a watchful mother could intercept, through an accessory. A small, folded, entirely decorative object that every woman of good standing carried as a matter of basic social equipment, that was expected in formal settings, and that no one thought twice about seeing in a woman's hand. The fan. Fans had been fashionable accessories in Europe since at least the 16th century, arriving via trade routes from China and Japan, where they had been in use considerably longer. By the Victorian period, a well-dressed woman's collection might span a significant range: ivory and lace for formal evenings, simpler silk or paper for daytime, black fans for morning, elaborately painted pieces for display. Each had its occasion, its appropriate setting, its associated social meaning even before it moved an inch. The fan's practical function was genuine. Victorian social spaces were often punishingly hot large gatherings, compressed dozens of heavily dressed bodies into rooms lit by candles or gas lighting, heated by fireplaces with no interest in subtlety, and ventilated by windows that polite society was reluctant to open on the grounds that drafts were dangerous. A fan moved air. This was useful. But the fan was also something a woman held, manipulated, and moved continuously through a social occasion, and this is the key to understanding why it became the medium for an entire communication system. You can say things with an object in your hand that you cannot say with your posture or your dress. The fan opened and closed. It tilted and turned. It was raised and lowered and angled. It touched the face, the lips, the ear, the shoulder. It could mark pauses, signal attention, indicate impatience, create distance, or beckon. And all of this movement was continuous, unremarkable, and critically deniable. A fan moving in a woman's hand was just a fan moving. It required a viewer with the specific vocabulary to read it as anything else. Everyone else saw a woman cooling herself down. The right person saw a sentence. The question of how systematically codified fan language actually was is one that historians have approached with some care, because the popular version of the story, every movement precisely fixed, universally known, practiced with the reliability of a telegraph, is somewhat more theatrical than the evidence strictly supports. There were published codifications of fan signals, some dating from the 18th century, and more appearing through the 19th, that assigned specific meanings to specific positions and movements. These were real documents, they existed, they were printed, they were sold, and at least some proportion of the women who bought them read them with genuine intent. What's less clear is how uniformly these codifications were shared between any two people in the same room. For the fan language to work as a communication system, rather than as a private symbolic vocabulary, both parties needed to be using the same dictionary. This was partly managed through the publishing of standardized guides which served the dual purpose of actually establishing a shared code, and of generating revenue for the publishers, who were not oblivious to the commercial appeal of selling a book promising secret romantic communication to young women, and partly through the informal transmission of signals through social networks, where what a particular gesture meant got established through use and mutual understanding rather than from any single authority. The practical result was a system that was real and functional, but more fluid than the perfectly fixed alphabet that romances about the period tend to describe. Certain signals were widely understood across a broad social community. Others were more locally specific, shared between particular groups, particular cities, particular social circles. A woman using fan language with a man she knew had a reasonable expectation that the core signals would be read correctly. A woman deploying subtler, less standard gestures was operating on more uncertain ground, which added an extra layer of interpretive negotiation to what was already a fairly complex communication channel. The basic vocabulary, insofar as it can be reconstructed from period sources, covered a range of emotional and social messages that map very neatly onto exactly the kinds of things a Victorian woman might need to communicate outside the approved channels. A fan held open and raised slowly to the lips signalled interest or affection, an invitation, in the context of a social occasion, that could be extended without any of the verbal directness that propriety ruled out. A fan snapped shut quickly communicated dismissal or rejection, efficient, clear, and requiring no explanation that a chaperone might overhear. A fan held partially open and moved slowly indicated uncertainty or hesitation, which in courtship contexts communicated something like, "I need more persuading," which is its own kind of message. A fan carried in the right hand in front of the face was an invitation to follow, presumably to a quieter corner of the room, where a more direct exchange might be possible, a suggestion that required considerable confidence to make and considerable nerve to act on. The fan held to the left ear conveyed one of the most functionally useful signals in the entire vocabulary. We are being watched, or someone nearby can hear this conversation. This was the warning signal, and it served a real social purpose in environments where a chaperone's attention might wander only to snap back at the worst possible moment. A fan against the left ear reset the interaction, allowed both parties to return to perfectly innocuous behaviour, and prevented whatever conversation had been developing from arriving at a point of no return under observation. It was, in essence, the Victorian equivalent of a phone vibration warning that someone is about to walk into the room except without the phone, and with considerably more elegance. A fan twirled in the left hand meant that the bearer had been noticed by someone she found interesting. A fan pressed to the heart communicated precisely what you might expect. A fan dropped on purpose, the apparent accident of accidentally letting the thing fall, was an invitation for the person nearby to retrieve it, creating a brief legitimate moment of physical proximity and potential private exchange in an environment that provided very few such moments. The dropped fan had to be distinguished, of course, from an actual accidental drop, which must have created some interpretive uncertainty in practice. Whether any Victorian gentleman ever spent time agonising over whether a fallen fan was an invitation, or just clumsiness, is not recorded, but one imagines it contributed to a certain amount of general social anxiety. The social logic of fan language becomes clearer when you consider what it was working around. Victorian courtship protocols were, by modern standards, remarkably restrictive about direct communication between young unmarried people. A young woman did not communicate freely with men who were not family members. She did not initiate conversations. She did not express opinions about people she might be interested in, at least not openly or to those people directly. The process of courtship, as the approved social script described it, was managed largely by parents, chaperones, and the careful progression of formal social interactions. Calls paid, introductions made, dances shared at properly supervised occasions rather than by the two people most immediately involved. This meant that the young woman and the young man whose future was, in theory, being determined by this process had remarkably limited direct access to each other. A conversation at a dance was supervised, brief, and publicly visible. A call paid to the family home was conducted with other family members present. A walk in a public park was accompanied by a chaperone whose job was specifically to prevent the conversation from becoming anything that propriety would object to. The courtship system was designed to protect women from inappropriate advances, which it did, and to protect families from unsuitable attachments, which it also did, and as a secondary effect it created conditions in which two people who genuinely wanted to communicate directly had to be quite creative about it. Fan language was one solution. It operated in the spaces that supervision couldn't fully close: the brief moments of proximity at a social gathering, the sight lines across a crowded room, the seconds when a chaperone's attention was elsewhere. It wasn't a substitute for conversation. It was a way of establishing that a conversation might eventually be worth having, of sending signals of interest or caution or invitation that the formal social script had no mechanism for delivering. The fans themselves were objects of considerable beauty and craftsmanship, and it's worth pausing on this because the object's qualities were not separate from its communicative function. A fan was chosen deliberately for a social occasion, in the same way that every other element of a woman's appearance was chosen deliberately. The fan she carried told observers something about her taste, her social position, and her relationship to the specific occasion. A young woman attending her first formal ball would carry something different from a married woman at a dinner party, which would be different from what either of them would carry for a daytime visit. The finest fans of the period were genuine works of applied art. Painted fans featured miniature scenes executed in gouache or watercolour on thin vellum or silk landscapes, mythological subjects, pastoral scenes, occasionally portraits. The sticks and guards, the structural elements of the folding fan, might be carved ivory, tortoiseshell, mother of pearl, lacquered wood, or gilded bone. Lace fans were made with the same handmade lace that appeared in the most expensive collars and trims, and carried the same social signal. This is costly. This was made by skilled hands, and the person carrying it belongs in a setting where these things are normal. At the other end of the scale were the cheap paper fans that manufacturing made widely available by the second half of the century, an important development, because it extended access to the fan as a social object well beyond the wealthy. A middle-class woman attending a modest social gathering could carry a fan without the expense of a lacquered ivory specimen, and while the social signal was different, the communicative vocabulary available to her was the same. The language didn't require the most expensive dictionary. The act of choosing a fan for an occasion was also itself an opportunity for expression. The colours, the imagery, the materials all communicated things. A fan with a romantic or sentimental painted scene carried to a gathering where a particular person would be present was a message of its own kind, even before it moved. A plain, unadorned fan in a context where decoration was expected communicated a kind of studied restraint that could be its own statement. Victorian women understood that the fan was part of the total composition of their appearance, and they treated it accordingly. There's something genuinely remarkable about the fan language tradition when you consider it in the context of everything else we've discussed about the Victorian women's world. The dress code constrained the body. The gaze code constrained vision. The rules of social interaction constrained speech. The chaperone system constrained physical movement and proximity. At every level, the environment restricted what a woman could say, where she could look, how she could move, and who she could talk to without supervision. And into this environment, women introduced a communication system that operated entirely within the approved space using an approved object, in an approved setting, through a movement that was expected and unremarkable to say things that the environment was specifically designed to prevent them from saying. This wasn't dramatic rebellion. It wasn't a manifesto. It was considerably more interesting than either of those things. It was intelligence applied to constraint, finding the gap the rules had forgotten to close and slipping through it so smoothly that the people holding the rules never quite noticed. The fan language was not the only example of this kind of creative navigation within Victorian social rules. We'll encounter others, but it's one of the most elegant. It worked because it was entirely invisible to anyone who didn't know it existed. The chaperone saw a woman cooling herself. The parents across the room saw normal social behaviour. The intended recipient saw something entirely different. The same object, the same movement, two completely different messages depending on whether you had the key. Fan language was also not exclusively romantic in its applications, which is how it tends to be described in popular accounts. The warning signal, the fan to the ear, was used between women as well as between women and men, to indicate that discretion was needed, that someone nearby was listening, that the current conversation should be redirected towards safer topics. Women at social gatherings used fan signals to communicate with each other across rooms, to coordinate without the drawn-out negotiation that a verbal exchange would require, to share assessments of situations or people in real time without leaving a trace. This social intelligence network, the rapid, low-visibility communication between women at a gathering, conducted through accessories and gesture, and the micro-expressions of faces arranged to appear blandly pleasant, is one of the less remarked upon features of Victorian social life. It was real, it was practiced, and it was sophisticated. The Victorian drawing room, which might appear to a casual observer as a space of pleasant and mildly tedious social performance, was, if you knew what you were looking at, running multiple parallel conversations simultaneously, most of them invisible to anyone who hadn't earned access to the vocabulary. The fan was the most formalized of these channels, but it was part of a broader communicative infrastructure that women built within the constraints of an environment that nominally restricted their communication at every turn. The restrictions were real. The infrastructure that worked around them was also real. Both things were true at the same time, which is typically how human ingenuity operates when it encounters rules it cannot simply ignore. The decline of the fan as a primary social accessory came gradually through the late Victorian and Edwardian periods as social norms shifted, as the occasions that required formal accessories changed, and as the communication channels that fan language had been invented to supplement became slightly more available. By the time the 20th century arrived with its somewhat more direct approach to social interaction, the elaborate vocabulary of fan positions and movements was becoming a historical curiosity rather than a living practice, but the fan itself persisted as a cultural symbol of exactly what it had been, a tool for saying things that couldn't be said directly, in the hands of women who had learned, with considerable ingenuity, to say them anyway. The Victorian feint has a reputation problem. In the popular imagination, it is the definitive image of Victorian female fragility, the delicate woman overwhelmed by the world, clutching her smelling salts, collapsing gracefully in a way that requires other people to catch her and bring her water. It seems, on its surface, like the perfect emblem of everything the Victorian social system did to women, made them physically weak through tight lacing, socially helpless through a culture of enforced dependence, and prone to theatrical displays of incapacity at the slightest provocation. This reading has the facts roughly right, and the interpretation almost entirely backwards. Because the Victorian feint, or more precisely, the Victorian woman's relationship to the feint as a social tool, was not primarily a symptom of powerlessness. It was, in many documented cases, one of the most effective instruments of social power available to a woman in an environment that had stripped most of the obvious ones away. The feint was, at its most sophisticated, less a medical event and more a performance. A very good performance, executed with timing, skill, and a precise understanding of what it would achieve. Let's start with the physiological baseline, because some Victorian women did faint, genuinely and involuntarily, for reasons that were entirely the fault of their wardrobe rather than their character. The corset's compression of the diaphragm genuinely restricted breathing in the ways described earlier in this series. The combination of this restricted breathing, the significant weight of the clothing pressing on the body, the heated and poorly ventilated rooms that formal social occasions typically occupied, the physical demands of dancing for several hours in an ensemble that weighed upward of 12 kilograms, and the social pressure to appear composed and unaffected through all of it. This was a genuine recipe for real medical difficulty. A woman who spent a long evening in a tightly laced corset, in a hot room, standing for extended periods, eating minimally because eating too enthusiastically was itself a social mistake, was a woman whose body was operating under real strain. Real fainting under these conditions was not unusual and not feigned. The smelling salts small bottles of ammonium carbonate solution, which released a sharp ammonia vapour when opened near the nose and triggered an involuntary inhale that temporarily elevated blood pressure, were a genuine medical necessity for some women in some situations, not simply theatrical props. But, and this is an important but, the social response to fainting was so established, so choreographed, so reliably predictable in its effects, that a woman who was not actually about to lose consciousness could deploy the symptoms of imminent fainting with considerable confidence about what would happen next. And what would happen next was very useful indeed. A woman who showed signs of faintness at a Victorian social occasion triggered an immediate and invariable social protocol. The people nearby stopped whatever they were doing. Space was cleared. Someone produced smelling salts, they were always available. Every hostess kept them, most women carried their own. The woman was guided to a chair or a settee or a private room. Conversation around her was suspended or redirected. Her needs became, for the duration of the episode, the organising principle of the immediate social environment. Other people's agendas, the conversations they were having, the negotiations they were conducting, the situations they were managing yielded entirely to the requirement of attending to the woman who had fainted. The power embedded in this protocol is not subtle. In a social environment where a woman's ability to direct the room's attention, to alter the flow of events, to exit a situation she found unpleasant, and to avoid an interaction she wished to avoid were all severely restricted by propriety and convention, the feint was a mechanism that did all of these things simultaneously and without requiring any explanation. You didn't have to say why you needed to leave the conversation. You didn't have to articulate an objection or a preference. Your body, or your body's performance, simply made the situation untenable, and the situation reorganized itself around that fact. The documented uses of strategic fainting in Victorian social and domestic life cover a remarkable range of situations. The social gathering that had become boring or uncomfortable could be exited. The conversation that was moving toward a subject the woman preferred not to engage with could be interrupted at precisely the right moment. The unwanted suitor whose attentions were becoming difficult to manage without causing offence could be avoided through an episode that removed the woman from the room and allowed her return to be managed at a time of her choosing, when he had presumably found someone else to occupy his attention. More consequentially, the negotiation of marriage arrangements, which in Victorian upper and middle-class families was a serious high-stakes process involving the interests of multiple parties, most of whom had more formal authority in the matter than the woman most directly affected, could be influenced through a well-timed episode of weakness. A woman who fainted during a conversation about a match she found deeply unsuitable was not, technically, expressing an opinion. She was simply unwell. The conversation had to be suspended. The decision had to wait. And in the interval that a prolonged or recurring episode created, circumstances sometimes shifted, the suitor reconsidered, the family reconsidered, alternative options appeared, time passed in ways that changed the situation. This is not a power that would impress a modern observer looking for examples of feminist agency. It's a power that worked by exploiting rather than challenging the system's terms specifically, the system's insistence on female fragility, which it accepted as leverage and used accordingly. But it was power, in an environment where most of the other kinds weren't available, and the women who used it understood what they were doing, even if they would not have described it in these terms and even if the performance had to be sustained with a straight face. The smelling salts that accompanied this whole ecosystem deserve a brief dedicated paragraph, because they are one of those objects that Victorian popular culture has preserved as an image without always explaining why they were so ubiquitous. Ammonium carbonate, the active compound in most Victorian smelling salts, produces a sharp release of ammonia gas when the solution is exposed to air pungent enough to penetrate even a genuine loss of consciousness and trigger the body's involuntary breathing response. It worked in genuine medical emergencies. It also provided, for less genuine emergencies, a reliable prop. The small decorative bottles in which smelling salts were kept were themselves fashionable accessories, often silver or cut glass, sometimes quite elaborate in their design, carried in a small bag or tucked into a pocket. They appeared on dressing tables. They were passed between women at gatherings. They were one of those objects whose very presence communicated something about the bearer's understanding of social norms. She was prepared, she was responsible, she understood that women sometimes needed them. Carrying smelling salts was, in other words, itself a social performance of appropriate femininity, which is a layer of irony that the Victorian period apparently found entirely comfortable. The ritual of reviving a woman who had fainted involved the smelling salts prominently, along with the loosening of any restrictive clothing if possible, a glass of water, a quiet space, and a general atmosphere of concerned attention. Experienced hostesses knew exactly how to manage the protocol efficiently without disrupting the entire evening. A faint handled with sufficient speed and skill could be absorbed into the social occasion without lasting disruption, which was the ideal outcome for everyone, except, possibly, the woman who had wanted more disruption than that. The cultural expectation of female fragility that made the faint so socially potent was not, of course, something Victorian women had created for their own convenience. It was a feature of the period's broader understanding of female nature, the belief, widespread and regularly reinforced by medical opinion, that women were constitutionally more delicate than men, more susceptible to emotional and physical disturbance, more in need of protection from the stresses of the world. This belief was used to justify the restrictions on women's education, employment, and public participation. It was invoked to explain why women couldn't be trusted with political decisions. It was the foundational assumption beneath a significant portion of the social architecture we've been examining in this series. Victorian women lived inside this belief, were shaped by it, were in various ways limited and damaged by it. But the faint represents a specific and rather elegant case of taking the assumption on its own terms and finding the leverage inside it. If the system believed women were fragile, and if the system organized itself to respond to female fragility in predictable ways, then fragility genuine or performed could be used as an input into the system's machinery. The system had built a lever, and some women discovered it pointed in a useful direction. The social management of the faint also reveals something about the collective understanding that operated between women in Victorian social settings. A woman who experienced a faint was attended to by other women, as well as by whatever male relatives or servants were present. The women who attended her, who brought the salts, who guided her to a chair, who stayed with her in the private room, who smoothed over the disruption with the other guests, were operating with a shared knowledge of both the medical and the social dimensions of the event. They understood what was happening in both senses, and the discretion they applied to the management of these episodes suggests that the shared knowledge included not just the practical response, but a kind of professional understanding about what didn't need to be discussed. There are accounts in diaries and correspondence of the period that reference, with varying degrees of explicitness, the calculated dimensions of social fainting. Sometimes it's described with amused acknowledgement, a woman noting that a friend had found a conveniently timed moment to be unwell. Sometimes it's described with genuine sympathy that doesn't preclude an awareness of the timing. The Victorian social world was full of people who understood the gap between official narratives and operational realities, and who navigated that gap with a tact that prevented the official narrative from being openly contradicted, while allowing the operational reality to proceed. This is, in microcosm, how a lot of Victorian social life worked. The official story was that women were delicate, that their fragility was medical, that their need for protection was genuine and freely accepted. The operational reality included a significant amount of intelligent management of the conditions and appearances that the official story created. The two could coexist as long as no one said too loudly, in too public a setting, that they had noticed the gap. The feint existed on a spectrum with other forms of managed physical performance that Victorian women used in the navigation of social life. The headache was its ambulatory cousin, less dramatic, more versatile, applicable in a wider range of situations and carrying a slightly different social coding. The headache excused early departure from social occasions. It created requirements for quiet and rest that were difficult for others to contest. It allowed a woman to absent herself from domestic activities that she found objectionable by producing a symptom that was both entirely real in its experience and entirely impossible to verify from outside. The headache was the Swiss Army knife of Victorian female indisposition, adaptable to almost any situation that required a graceful exit. The Victorian medical category of nerves served a related social function at a higher level of severity. A woman with nerves was understood to be constitutionally sensitive, reactive to stress, prone to anxiety, potentially destabilized by excessive social or domestic demand. This diagnosis, when applied to a woman by a sympathetic physician, created a medical endorsement for reduced social obligation, for quieter living, for protection from the specific situations that triggered the symptoms. It was in some cases a genuine clinical description. Anxiety and its related conditions are real. They were real then, and women who suffered from them suffered genuinely. But the category was also elastic enough to encompass a range of situations in which a woman's primary problem was not anxiety, but an environment she was not free to simply refuse, and a medical framework provided the one form of legitimate objection available. The Victorian medical establishment's role in both creating and managing these dynamics is a subject that deserves its own chapter, and we'll get one later in this series. But it's worth noting here that the relationship between women and the medical framing of their bodies was not simply one of passive subjection. Victorian women were active in seeking diagnoses that created useful social outcomes, in finding physicians whose understanding of their condition aligned with their practical needs, and in using the medical framework as a resource, in the same way they used other resources, strategically, in service of navigating an environment that offered limited options. The feint, the headache, the nerves. These were not simply expressions of a system that had broken women down. They were also, in practice, tools in a toolkit assembled by women who had figured out what the system would respond to, and had decided to give it exactly that. This doesn't make the system better. A world in which the most effective social lever available to a woman is simulated in capacity is not a world that has organized itself intelligently around female dignity or capability. But it does make the women who navigated it more interesting than the image of passive Victorian fragility suggests. They were not fragile. They were, in many cases, enormously resourceful. The performance of fragility was one of the more demanding things they did, and it required a specific kind of intelligence, the intelligence of a person who understands, very precisely, how a system works, and who has decided to use that understanding for her own purposes while appearing not to understand anything at all. That's a skill, an exhausting one, but a skill. There is something almost philosophically ambitious about the Victorian dinner table. In most cultures and most periods of history, the shared meal is a social occasion, a space for connection, conversation, and the straightforward pleasure of eating food in the company of other people. The Victorians looked at this arrangement and thought, yes, but what if we made it harder? The Victorian dining table was not simply a place to eat. It was a testing ground. It was a stage. It was a finely calibrated instrument for measuring the character, breeding and moral worth of everyone seated at it, and it ran those measurements continuously, from the moment the guests were seated until the moment they rose and moved elsewhere. Every fork placement, every bite size, every conversational choice, every decision about whether to accept a second helping, all of it was observable, all of it was noted, and all of it communicated something specific about the person being watched. The dining room was where Victorian society went to find out what people were really made of, which sounds like a reasonable goal until you discover that what you were made of was measured partly by whether you held your soup spoon at the correct angle. The degree of social surveillance applied to eating was, even by Victorian standards, impressive. and the rules that governed it were, even by Victorian standards, extensive, specific, and almost entirely unwritten, which meant they could be known completely only by those who had absorbed them from birth, and failed invisibly by anyone who had not. Let's start with the physical arrangement of the Victorian dinner, because the table itself was a kind of argument before a single plate arrived. By the mid-Victorian period, the formal dinner had settled into a specific format à la Russe, as it was called, meaning service in the Russian style, in which dishes were brought to the table sequentially by servants and served to each diner individually, rather than placed on the table all at once for guests to serve themselves. This was considered the sophisticated, modern approach, and it had largely replaced the earlier fashion of covering the entire table with dishes simultaneously, which had the democratic appeal of allowing everyone to reach what they wanted, but the social disadvantage of looking to refined Victorian eyes somewhat chaotic. À la Russe service required a specific table arrangement. Multiple sets of cutlery were laid at each place forks to the left, knives and spoons to the right, arranged in order of use from the outside in, so that you worked your way through the implements as the courses progressed. A well-set table might include upward of 5 or 6 pieces of cutlery per person, several glasses for different wines, a bread plate, various small dishes, and a succession of differently sized plates that arrived and departed as the courses changed. The total surface area dedicated to a single diner's place setting at a formal dinner could be genuinely startling to a modern observer accustomed to a fork, a knife, and a modest ambition. Navigating this arrangement correctly was the first test. Using the wrong fork for the wrong course was a mistake, not a catastrophic one, but a visible one, the kind that caught the attention of observant neighbours and confirmed whatever preliminary assessments they had already made. The etiquette manuals were clear: work from the outside in, don't touch implements before they're needed, and for heaven's sake don't hold up the utensil to examine which one it is before using it, because that was the fastest possible way to announce that you had no idea what you were doing. The question of how to hold the cutlery was itself a topic of considerable cultural anxiety. The proper Victorian grip on a fork was a specific thing, quite different from either the way many people hold one today or the way a person who had never been formally instructed might hold one naturally. The fork was held with the tines pointing downward in the continental style that the British upper classes were gradually adopting through the 19th century, not scooped upward like a shovel, which was considered the mark of a person who had not been properly taught, and which acquired the faintly devastating social nickname of the American grip in certain British etiquette literature. Whether this was a fair characterization of American table manners at the time is a separate question, but the nickname tells you something about what it was meant to communicate about the user. The knife was held with the handle in the palm and the index finger extended along the top of the blade, not gripped like a pen, not held like a weapon, not used to convey food to the mouth, which was a practice so firmly associated with a lack of breeding that the mere sight of someone lifting a knife toward their face could apparently send a ripple of silent distress around a formally set Victorian table. The physical mechanics of Victorian cutlery use required genuine training to master, which is precisely why they functioned so effectively as a class marker. Anyone who had grown up in the right kind of household had absorbed these mechanics without effort and performed them without thought, while anyone who had not could betray themselves in the first 5 minutes of a meal through the simple act of picking up a fork. For women specifically, the standards governing eating behaviour were an additional layer of a system of physical self-management that we've already seen at work in the dress code and the etiquette of movement. But the dining room added a dimension that the drawing room and the street did not, the direct management of appetite. And this is where things get genuinely interesting. The Victorian ideal of feminine eating was not simply about manners in the technical sense. It was about the visible relationship between a woman and her own physical needs. A woman who ate with obvious pleasure, who consumed generous portions, who accepted second helpings without hesitation, who showed visible enthusiasm for food. This woman was communicating something about herself that the Victorian social framework considered distinctly unflattering. She had appetites, visible, unmistakable, physical appetites. And while appetite was broadly considered natural in men, a man with a healthy appetite was robust, vigorous, constitutionally sound in women. It carried a different set of associations that the period preferred to avoid examining too directly. Etiquette manuals of the period, and the conduct literature aimed at young women that appeared in considerable volume throughout the Victorian era, were specific on this point. Women were advised to eat delicately and moderately, to prefer lighter dishes over heavier ones, to decline rich foods gracefully, and to demonstrate through their eating behaviour that they were not particularly governed by physical desire of any kind. The light eater was refined. The enthusiastic eater was, at minimum, slightly vulgar. At worst, she was suggesting something about her character that the language of the table was considered too indirect to name. Meat was particularly freighted in this context. Heavy red meat was considered robust, energetic, somewhat masculine in its associations. Women who ate it freely were, by the logic of the period's nutritional and social thinking, either demonstrating an unladylike vigour or displaying a carnality that the refined sensibility was supposed to transcend. The preferred feminine diet, as described in the advice literature, leaned toward lighter fare: fish, white meat, delicate soups, vegetables, small pastries. These foods were associated with the kind of refined, controlled, physically undemanding existence that the ideal of respectable femininity prescribed. They were also, not coincidentally, the foods that required the least visible effort to consume: no cutting through resistance, no working at bones, no evidence of real engagement with the physical act of eating. The practical result of all this was that a woman at a formal dinner was expected to eat in a way that managed to sustain the impression that she was not particularly interested in eating, which required some ingenuity, given that the dinner could last 2 hours and involve 8 or more courses, and that she had been wearing a corset since morning and had presumably eaten minimally earlier in the day, because eating too substantially before a dinner at which one would be observed was its own social miscalculation. The pace of eating was regulated in ways that created a narrow and somewhat paradoxical target to hit. Eating too quickly communicated greed and unseemly urgency about getting the food into one's body that suggested either an unsuitably strong appetite or insufficient breeding to manage it. Eating too slowly was also problematic. It could suggest affectation, a kind of performative delicacy that was its own form of social miscalculation, or it could simply disrupt the rhythm of the meal and create awkwardness for the servants and the host. The right pace was the pace of everyone else at the table, matching the general flow of the meal without standing out in either direction. This sounds straightforward until you consider that the general pace of the table was not actually an agreed-upon standard. It was a collective negotiation, constantly adjusted as courses arrived and conversations demanded attention, and matching it required the kind of social attentiveness that could only be maintained by someone who was simultaneously eating, talking, listening, managing their physical presentation, and calibrating their pace to the room, all without appearing to be doing any of those things consciously. The rule about second helpings deserves particular attention because it illustrates the Victorian table's relationship to desire in its most compressed form. Accepting a second portion of a dish was considered, in most formal dining contexts, somewhat inadvisable for a woman. The acceptable position was to decline graciously, without apparent reluctance that might suggest the decline was an effort, in a way that communicated serene satisfaction rather than frustrated restraint. The woman who accepted seconds communicated that the first portion had not been sufficient, which communicated appetite, which communicated all the things appetite was supposed not to communicate. The woman who ostentatiously declined communicated something almost as problematic in the other direction, a visible performance of abstinence that called attention to itself and to the appetite being managed. The ideal, naturally, was a decline so natural and unforced that it required no comment. A gentle shake of the head, a small gesture of the hand, a thank you, no that conveyed nothing beyond the bare fact of not wanting more. Simple, straightforward, the product of approximately zero actual effort, except that it required constant practice to execute correctly, and the margin between doing it right and doing it in a way that was noticed for the wrong reasons was, as with so many things at the Victorian table, very narrow indeed. The position of the body at the table was its own separate department of regulation. Elbows, naturally, belonged nowhere near the table surface. This particular rule has survived into the present with unusual cultural persistence, which suggests it may be among the more robust pieces of Victorian etiquette to make it across the intervening century. But the rule about elbows was part of a larger set of physical expectations that governed posture, proximity to the table, and the management of the body during eating. A woman at the Victorian dinner table was expected to sit upright the same erect posture that her clothing architecture already enforced, but now maintained in the specific context of leaning slightly toward a table, handling utensils, and managing the physical act of eating in a way that produced no ungainly angles, no visible effort, no suggestion that eating was a physical activity that engaged the body in any strenuous way. Hunching over the plate was wrong. Sitting so far back from it that bringing food to the mouth required visible effort was equally wrong. The approved relationship to the table had the quality of most Victorian approved relationships to physical space: effortfully achieved, apparently effortless, and impossible to explain to someone who hadn't grown up with it. The napkin was an object with its own rules. It was placed in the lap when seated, not tucked into the collar, which was a practice associated with children, the elderly, and people who ate in ways the collar needed protection from. It was used to blot the lips discreetly, not to wipe the face as one might wipe a surface, not to signal the end of the meal by placing it on the table before everyone else was finished, and not to be twisted, folded, or otherwise manipulated into arrangements that suggested nervousness or boredom. The napkin was a supporting actor in the performance of composed, controlled eating, and like all supporting actors, its success was measured by the degree to which nobody noticed it. Conversation at the Victorian dinner table operated under a separate but equally complex set of rules, and the management of both eating and talking simultaneously was perhaps the most demanding aspect of the whole occasion. The dinner table was a primary social venue, one of the few settings in which a mixed gathering of men and women could engage in substantive conversation, and one in which the quality of the conversation was understood to reflect on the host, the hostess, and every guest at the table. The topics available for dinner conversation were bounded by a set of prohibitions that were specific and, in some cases, genuinely interesting in their specificity. Money was not discussed. Not one's own, not others, not the cost of anything, not financial concerns of any kind. The prohibition on money talk at the Victorian dinner table operated across all social classes, from the aristocracy, who considered it beneath dignity, to the middle classes, who considered it anxious and vulgar, and was sufficiently robust that even indirect references to cost or value were considered in poor taste. This created some conversational delicacy around topics that inevitably touched on financial reality, but the Victorians were practiced in the art of discussing things while appearing not to discuss them, so the manoeuvre was manageable. Health and illness were similarly restricted. Not because illness was unimportant. Victorian England was extremely occupied with health concerns, given that the century brought both significant medical progress and a range of diseases that were still doing their best work, but because detailed discussion of physical symptoms and bodily conditions at a dinner table was considered inappropriate in a way that mixed the private and the public in directions. The Victorian preference for compartmentalisation found uncomfortable. A brief acknowledgement that someone had been unwell was acceptable. A clinical account of symptoms and treatments was not. The dining room was for the social self, not the physical self, and the physical self was supposed to remain decorously off stage. Politics was the most contextually variable prohibition. In some households, political conversation at dinner was entirely acceptable, and indeed the central purpose of the occasion. Political dinners were a real institution, particularly in the upper reaches of Victorian society, where the overlap between social and political life was substantial. In mixed company, however, and in households where the primary social function of the dinner was not political networking, strong political opinions expressed at table were considered potentially disruptive. Women, in particular, were expected to avoid political expression at dinner, partly because formal political participation was not available to women through most of the period, and partly because a woman with visibly strong political opinions was disrupting a set of social conventions about what women were supposed to bring to the dinner table, which was social grace, pleasant conversation, and the appearance of mild interest in everything, and strong opinions about nothing in particular. The dinner table conversation had a spatial dimension as well, governed by the seating arrangement and the protocol around it. At a formal dinner, the host and hostess sat at opposite ends of the table, and the most important guests ranked by social precedence sat nearest them. The conversation was expected to flow along the table in a specific pattern. During one course, you talked to the person on your right, during another to the person on your left. This rotation ensured that no guest was left without conversation for too long, and that no single pairing monopolized each other's attention throughout the meal, both of which were considered social disasters to be avoided. Navigating this rotation required a certain athletic quality of social attention. You had to be fully engaged with the conversation on your right, read the moment when the rotation was expected, complete the transition without abruptness or obvious relief, and immediately establish engaged conversation with the person on your left, regardless of whether the pairing was promising. The guest who turned before the expected moment was rude. The guest who failed to turn and kept talking exclusively to one neighbour was also rude. The guest who turned on cue but was unable to generate conversation with the new neighbour was creating a social vacancy that was, if anything, the worst outcome of all. Women who were skilled at the dinner table rotation were socially valuable in a specific and practical way. A woman who could generate interesting, appropriate, effortlessly managed conversation with any neighbour placed beside her on the right for half the meal, on the left for the other half, regardless of whether the neighbour was interesting, sympathetic, or conversationally forthcoming, was an asset to any dinner party. She smoothed the social mechanics of the occasion, prevented the silences and awkwardnesses that made hosts anxious, and demonstrated the specific quality that the Victorians found most admirable in social women: the ability to be reliably pleasant without being visibly effortful about it. The topics that were safe for dinner table conversation were, consequently, the topics that could be reliably interesting without ever risking the social turbulence that money, illness, or politics might generate. Literature, art, travel, the theatre, recent improvements in the neighbourhood, the weather understood as an opening gambit rather than a genuine subject, these were the approved zones, and a woman who could navigate them with real intelligence and genuine curiosity, while appearing to make no particular effort and never stepping into one of the restricted territories, was doing something considerably more skilled than the surface placidity of the conversation suggested. Wine and alcohol at the Victorian dinner table created their own set of gender-specific expectations. Men were expected to drink wine with dinner, to engage with the wine that was offered and served, and to develop the vocabulary and palate that allowed them to discuss wine with appropriate knowledge. Women occupied a more complicated position. Drinking wine at dinner was acceptable. Abstaining entirely could, in some contexts, create its own small awkwardness, but the quantity and enthusiasm of a woman's engagement with the wine was observed in the same way that her engagement with the food was observed. Too enthusiastic, and the same questions about appetite and desire that governed the food rules came into play. The correct female relationship to wine was one of gracious appreciation without obvious reliance, a sip here, a mild comment on the claret, a willingness to engage without the kind of sustained engagement that would be interpreted as meaning anything beyond mild social lubrication. This created the characteristic Victorian dinner table phenomenon of women who held wine glasses for extended periods without drinking from them, the glass as accessory, the wine as prop, the appearance of participation without its more consequential dimensions. Whether the women involved found this particularly frustrating probably depended on how much they were enjoying the wine and how long the dinner was running. The moment toward the end of the meal when the women withdrew from the dining room, leaving the men to their port and their conversations that were apparently too frank for mixed company, was a Victorian ritual that has been much discussed and variously interpreted. The official explanation that women withdrew out of delicacy, allowing the men to discuss business and politics in an environment suited to such robust topics, contained the now familiar logic of the period. Women were protected from the rougher elements of life, including apparently the rougher elements of after-dinner conversation. The practical reality was that the post-dinner separation also provided women with their own conversation time, in the drawing room, in the company exclusively of each other, where the rules of mixed company table talk no longer applied, and a different kind of exchange became possible. The drawing room conversation after the women withdrew was, by some accounts, often the more interesting half of the evening. Freed from the presence of men, and from the conversational protocols that mixed company imposed, women talked about a range of subjects that dinner table etiquette had placed off limits. They shared information, they assessed situations, they discussed the people present at the gathering, with a directness that the dinner table's requirement for diplomatic pleasantness had prevented. The withdrawal was, in this sense, a release valve, the point in the evening when the performance of appropriate feminine dinner behaviour could be relaxed, briefly, among people who had all been performing it and knew exactly what it was. The specific rules around particular dishes and foods could fill a volume on their own, but a few are worth noting because they illustrate the broader principle with particular clarity. Soup was consumed from the side of the spoon, not the tip tilted away from the diner when taking it into the spoon, not toward and was not blown upon to cool it, not slurped, not approached with any evident urgency regardless of how hot it was. The soup rule is one of those rules that sounds absurd when stated plainly, and yet is instantly recognizable as carrying real social weight, because the alternative, blowing on your soup, or tilting the spoon toward yourself, or audibly consuming it, does communicate something, if only that you were not taught the right way and have therefore revealed something about the circumstances of your upbringing. Bread was broken by hand, never cut with a knife, and eaten in small pieces rather than bitten directly from the roll or the slice. Fish was eaten with a fish fork and a fish knife, specific implements designed for the purpose, and not with the general-purpose cutlery that might otherwise be pressed into service by someone who had not noticed the fish course coming and had already used their relevant fork on something else. Fruit, at the end of the meal, was handled with specific tools and eaten in specific ways depending on the type, peeling, slicing, consuming in delicate portions, rather than biting directly into anything that might produce juice, mess, or the appearance of animal enthusiasm for the eating of fruit. The underlying principle across all of these rules was the same. The act of eating was to be managed so that no evidence of actual physical engagement with food became visible. The Victorian dinner table ideal was a paradox, a meal at which eating happened but did not appear to be happening, at which everyone present was clearly consuming food, but no one was visibly hungry, at which physical sustenance was provided and received without any of the obvious signs that a physical being was being sustained. The food was real. The hunger was presumably real. The rules existed to make both of them invisible. Below the level of formal dinner etiquette was the entire world of everyday domestic eating, which operated under a somewhat relaxed version of the same principles. Breakfast, the midday meal, afternoon tea each had its own codes, somewhat less demanding than the full formal dinner but operating on the same fundamental logic. Tea, in particular, occupied a specific social space that generated its own considerable body of custom and rule. The afternoon tea, which became a fixture of middle and upper-class Victorian domestic life in the mid-century, was an occasion governed by etiquette that was simpler than a formal dinner but no less specific in its expectations. The correct management of a teacup, how it was held, whether the saucer was lifted with it or left on the table, how the tea was poured and by whom, whether milk went in first or last was a matter of surprisingly strong opinion in Victorian social life, and the milk first versus tea first debate carried class connotations that the people involved were perfectly aware of, and felt no need to pretend were not present. Sandwiches at afternoon tea were eaten in specific ways. Cakes and pastries were managed with forks when appropriate, and fingers when the formality of the occasion permitted it. The tea itself was poured by the hostess, which was a role with its own protocols around order, preference, and the management of requests. A good hostess remembered how each guest took their tea and provided it without interrogation, which was considered a mark of genuine attentiveness. The social work done by the afternoon tea was considerable. It was an occasion at which women could meet, talk, and exchange information in a context that had no male component and no formal structure beyond the mild requirements of the tea service itself. The relative informality of the occasion, combined with the all-female company that it often involved, made it a space in which the more compressed and controlled behaviour required at mixed formal dinners could be somewhat relaxed. Not entirely, this was still a social occasion, and the performance requirements of social occasions still applied, but the volume turned down a few notches, and the conversations that happened over afternoon tea were sometimes rather more honest than those that happened over dinner. The entire edifice of Victorian dining etiquette rested on a foundational principle that it shared with every other domain of Victorian social behaviour we've examined, the idea that the social surface was the social self. What you presented to others was, for practical social purposes, what you were. A woman who ate correctly, who managed her portions, her pace, her posture, her conversation, and her relationship to every element of the table, with the smooth competence that the rules required, was demonstrating a character that had absorbed the right values and internalized the right discipline. A woman who ate incorrectly was demonstrating the absence of those things. Whether she was actually a person of good character was, strictly speaking, a separate question, one that the Victorian dinner table was not especially designed to answer. The dinner table measured compliance with the rules of the dinner table, and then read that compliance as evidence of deeper qualities that were not actually visible at the dinner table at all. This is a system of inference that has some significant logical problems when you examine it directly. which is possibly why Victorian social culture preferred not to examine it directly, and instead simply maintained the association between correct eating behaviour and personal virtue with sufficient confidence that questioning it felt impolite. The woman who had mastered the Victorian dinner table, who ate the right things in the right amounts, in the right ways at the right pace, while conducting the right conversations about the right topics in the right tone with the right neighbours, was not demonstrating good character. She was demonstrating that she had been trained correctly and had the continuous self-discipline to apply that training throughout a 2-hour meal in company. This is a real skill, and it deserves some acknowledgement as such. It is just not the same skill as having good character, and the conflation of the two says something about a social system that found it more convenient to measure the visible surface than to examine what was underneath it. The fork held correctly. The second helping declined graciously. The conversation steered smoothly away from money. The wine glass held with appropriate detachment, all of it adding up to a performance of a specific kind of personhood that the room agreed, by silent collective consent, to accept as evidence of the real thing. Whether any of the women involved found this arrangement entirely satisfying is a question the dinner table etiquette was specifically designed to make it impossible to answer. At some point in the mid-19th century, someone looked at the already considerable complexity of Victorian social life, the dress codes, the gaze rules, the fan vocabulary, the dining regulations, the strategic feinting, and thought, you know what this needs? A bureaucratic paper system, with its own grammar and its own timing conventions, and approximately 400 pages of explanatory literature. The result was the Victorian calling card system, which managed to turn the simple act of visiting another person into a ritual so layered with meaning that a single small rectangle of printed cardboard could communicate several distinct social messages depending on which corner was bent, whether it was delivered by hand or left with a servant, what time of day it arrived, what was written on it, and how quickly the recipient responded. A business card today tells you someone's name and where to find them. A Victorian calling card told you their social position, their intentions, the nature of the relationship they were proposing, and the precise degree of interest they were expressing, all encoded in a piece of stiff paper approximately 3 inches wide. It was, in its way, a remarkable achievement. The Victorians had invented a communication system for managing social relationships with the precision of legal correspondence, while maintaining the appearance of casual social warmth, and the fact that most of its participants had memorized its rules without formal instruction and executed it without apparent effort was itself the point. Knowing how it worked demonstrated that you belonged in the world it governed. Not knowing revealed, quickly and irreversibly, that you did not. The calling card itself was the foundation. Getting the card right was the first requirement, before any of the protocol around its use could even begin. The Victorian calling card was an object governed by specific aesthetic standards that communicated social information through their own visual language before a single rule of use was applied. Size mattered, and it was different for men and women. A gentleman's card was slightly smaller than a lady's, approximately 3 inches by 1.5, give or take the variations of individual preference and the fashion of the particular decade. A lady's card was larger, wider, more generous in its dimensions. Married women's cards were larger than unmarried women's cards. A married couple had a joint card, wider still, on which both names appeared, with the wife's name above the husband's, a convention that seems, on the surface, to give precedence to the woman, though its practical effect was to make the card primarily hers for use during the social calls that were largely her domain and responsibility. The typeface was engraved, not printed, the distinction between engraving and other printing methods being perfectly legible to any Victorian eye and carrying real social significance. Engraving produced a slightly raised impression on the paper's surface that you could feel with your fingertip, a tactile quality that printing did not replicate. Engraved cards cost more and took longer to produce, which is precisely why they were the correct choice. A card that was merely printed rather than engraved communicated something about the bearer's relationship to expense that a correctly socialized person preferred not to communicate. The card was, in miniature, the same argument that the wardrobe made on a larger scale. The right investment in presentation was not vanity, it was social competence. The name on the card was given in full, with appropriate title, in a specific typeface and style that was itself subject to fashion and convention. Miss used the full first and last name. Mrs. indicated a married woman and used her husband's name with her own first name in a specific combination that itself varied by period and context. Courtesy titles, the Honourable Lady and so on appeared correctly or not at all, and appearing them incorrectly was naturally considerably worse than omitting them. The social information encoded in a name's presentation on a card was dense enough that an experienced observer could extract a significant amount of biographical data from a card before reading anything beyond the name itself. The quality of the paper and the card's overall production were the final elements of the object itself. Thick, cream, slightly textured cardstock was correct. Thin, white, or obviously cheap cardstock was not. Some women of taste had their cards produced on paper with a distinctive colour or texture that functioned as a kind of signature recognisable to regular correspondents and social partners, establishing a visual identity that extended beyond the words printed on it. The monogram, appearing in the card's upper left corner or embossed on its back, was another available personalising element for those with the standing and aesthetic confidence to deploy it effectively. The card case that carried these objects was itself a social accessory with its own requirements. Silver card cases were fashionable throughout the period. Leather was acceptable. Elaborately decorated enamel cases were produced and carried by women of means. A card case in poor condition, scratched, battered, evidently neglected, communicated something about its owner that the owner presumably didn't intend. The card case was produced, opened, and handled in social interactions, which meant it was seen and evaluated like every other visible element of a woman's presentation. The card inside was important. The container it came from was also important. This is the kind of detail that the Victorian social system generated with apparently unlimited enthusiasm. Now, the protocol. The system of calling and cards operated around the institution of the call, the formal visit paid to a household, and it was through this institution that middle and upper-class Victorian social networks were maintained, expanded, contracted, and managed. Calling was primarily a female responsibility. While men had their own social visiting practices, the management of a household social network through the formal call system fell to the woman of the house, and it was through her calling activity that the family's social connections were established and preserved. A call was a visit, typically in the afternoon, to another household, during the hours that convention designated as calling hours, generally between approximately 3 and 6 in the afternoon, with some variation by location and decade. The visitor arrived at the house, where a servant answered the door and presented her card. The first and most basic decision the system then required was simple. Was the mistress of the house at home to callers? Not physically at home in the Victorian calling sense meant available and willing to receive visitors, and a woman who was physically present in her house could perfectly legitimately instruct her servants to say she was not at home to callers she did not wish to receive, without any of the moral difficulty that this phrasing might suggest to a modern ear. Not at home was a social designation, not a geographical one. Everyone understood this. The fiction was entirely transparent and entirely functional. If the mistress was at home, the visitor was admitted, and a brief social call of approximately 15 to 30 minutes followed. Tea was typically served, light conversation was exchanged, and then the visitor departed. The visit was short by design. Overstaying a call was itself a social error, suggesting either that the visitor had insufficient other engagements competing for her time, or that she had failed to read the social cues indicating that her allotted time had elapsed. The ideal call was precisely calibrated to be long enough to accomplish its social purpose, and short enough to communicate that the caller's time was in demand elsewhere. The appearance of a busy social calendar was, as with everything else in this world, its own social signal. When the caller left a card, whether she was received or not, the card entered a system of obligations and responses that generated its own considerable complexity. A card left was a social gesture that required a response. Not responding to a card was itself a message. It communicated that the relationship was not being accepted or maintained at the level the caller had proposed, which could mean anything from deliberate social cold shouldering to a simple failure of management, both of which had very different implications and could not always be distinguished from outside. The timing of the response was where the rules became particularly specific. Returning a call too quickly appearing at someone's door the day after they had called on you communicated an eagerness that the social code found unbecoming. It suggested that the caller had no other obligations, that she had been waiting for the opportunity to respond, that the call had been an event of unusual significance in her social schedule rather than one item in a full and well-managed calendar. The correct response time was several days, the precise number varying by relationship and context. For an established friend, a response within 3 or 4 days was appropriate. For a newer acquaintance, slightly longer. The window communicated that you had noted the call, valued the relationship, and were responding in good time, but that your time was occupied with other things in between, as a properly social woman's time should be. The woman who called too quickly was too eager, a characterization that carried the same social charge that similar phrases carry, in any social environment where appearing to want things too much is itself a problem. The woman who took too long was careless or dismissive. The right interval required judgment, and that judgment was, predictably, one of the things that sorted the socially competent from the socially uncertain. Now we arrive at the corners, which are where things get genuinely intricate. The bent or folded corner of a calling card was a language of its own, and it is one of those elements of Victorian social life that, when described plainly, sounds like an elaborate fiction, but was entirely real and documented in considerable period literature. The corners of a calling card each corresponded to a different message, and folding one communicated that message more directly than leaving an unaltered card. The specific corner folded indicated the specific meaning, and the system varied somewhat between different published sources and different social communities. The familiar problem of the fan language, where the codification was real but not perfectly universal. The most widely documented versions of the system worked roughly as follows. A card with the upper right corner turned down indicated a personal call the card had been delivered by the caller herself, rather than sent via a servant. This was an important distinction. A card that arrived with a footman communicated a formal acknowledgement of social relationship. A card left personally communicated that the caller had actually made the journey to the house and stood at the door, which was a more substantial investment of time and energy, and was read accordingly. Leaving a card personally rather than sending it via servant was a warmer gesture, a more direct expression of social attention, and its absence sending a card without visiting could, in some contexts, be read as the minimum compliance with social obligation rather than genuine engagement. A card with the upper left corner turned indicated that congratulations were being extended on a birth, a marriage, a social occasion that merited acknowledgement. A lower left fold signified condolence. A lower right fold indicated that the caller was leaving the neighbourhood or the city, making a farewell call. I was here, I called, I'm going. The social relationship remains acknowledged across the distance. For a departing caller, leaving cards at all the households within one's social circle before departure was an obligation, and failing to do so before a long absence was a social oversight that would be noted. Multiple cards left at a single household, one for the mistress, one for the daughters who were out in society. Sometimes one for the master of the house followed their own conventions about how many to leave and for whom. A caller who left one card for a household of 3 socially active women was making a statement, though whether it was intentional parsimoniousness or simple ignorance of the rule was something the household would have to decide for themselves. Generally, multiple cards were left to cover the multiple adults in the household who were receiving calls, and leaving fewer than the correct number could suggest either that certain members of the household were not being socially acknowledged, or that the caller was unclear on the protocol, neither of which was ideal. The penciled annotation was another dimension of the card's communicative capacity. A word or brief phrase written in pencil in one of the corners of the card added a layer of personal message to the formal social object pencil rather than ink, because pencil communicated informality and immediacy, something added at the moment rather than printed as part of the card's permanent text. PPC pour prendre congé, a French abbreviation meaning to take leave, was one of the most common annotations, indicating a farewell call, often left when the caller could not make a personal visit before departure. The use of French abbreviations on calling cards was itself a small social signal, communicating familiarity with continental social conventions and the kind of cosmopolitan ease that social aspiration in Victorian England consistently associated with France. Other penciled annotations could include the times at which the household was at home. To callers, leaving this information on a card you left for a new acquaintance was a courtesy that invited reciprocal visiting, or brief notes that contextualized the purpose of the call, or simply a name written in pencil next to an engraved name to clarify which member of a family had actually called. The pencil annotation preserved the card's formal character, while allowing a small degree of personal communication that the printed text couldn't accommodate, and women who used these annotations skillfully could carry on a subtle social exchange through the medium of calling cards alone, without either party needing to actually meet. The silver card tray, which sat in the entrance hall of any household that received calls with appropriate seriousness, was the physical accumulation of all this social activity, a collection of cards representing the household's social relationships in miniature. Visitors entering a drawing room could, by the cards they noticed in the tray or on display, assess the social connections of the household and calibrate their understanding of where it stood in the social landscape. A tray crowded with cards from good addresses communicated one thing. A tray with few cards, or cards from modest addresses, communicated another. The tray was, in effect, the Victorian social media feed, a public display of one's connections, curated not by algorithm but by the social management choices of the woman of the house. Households that received many calls from people of high social standing had cards from those callers and displayed them in ways that made the connection visible. Whether the cards were actually from recent callers, or were being preserved from earlier in the season, or in some cases from earlier in the decade, was not necessarily obvious to a visitor who had no way to date them, and the etiquette literature is quietly clear that the tray's function was at least partly presentational. You managed your tray in the same way you managed everything else, to communicate the most flattering possible version of your social reality. The at-home day was a logical extension of the calling card system that simplified the management of calls for both hosts and visitors. A household that designated a specific day of the week as their at-home day published this information on their cards, by word of mouth through the social network, and received callers specifically on that day. This meant that their social obligations were concentrated into a predictable window, that visitors knew when to come, and that the household servants and the household itself could be prepared and presented at their best on a known schedule, rather than having to maintain maximum readiness at all times for the unpredictable arrival of a caller. The at-home day became widespread enough in the later Victorian period that some households had their day printed directly on their visiting card, which removed any ambiguity. The card in this case communicated name, title, and availability, a three-piece information package that condensed the social relationship into its most essential components. At which point the card had become, in its quiet way, remarkably efficient. A small object that established identity, signalled social standing, communicated reciprocal availability, and initiated a choreographed exchange of social gestures that could maintain a relationship indefinitely without either party ever needing to say anything particularly direct. The social tier system that the calling card protocol embedded in practice deserves examination, because it reveals something important about how Victorian social life managed the constant tension between its official meritocratic-ish values and its deep investment in hierarchy. Calling was, in principle, available to anyone. You could print a card and leave it at a house, but the system had mechanisms for accepting or rejecting callers that operated on clear hierarchical logic. A call that was not returned was a rejection. It was a quiet rejection, conducted entirely through inaction rather than any explicit statement, and it could always be attributed to oversight or busyness rather than deliberate intention, but it was recognised for what it was by both parties. A household that consistently was not at home to a particular caller, or that failed to return her card within any reasonable period, was communicating that the proposed social relationship was not accepted. The caller could try again, but a second failure of return communicated the message with more emphasis, and a socially intelligent person would generally not attempt a third. This meant that upward social mobility through the calling card system required getting past this silent refusal mechanism, which was difficult precisely because it was silent. The person of ambiguous social standing who wished to establish connections with households above her in the hierarchy had to get a card admitted, have it returned, and then navigate the subsequent relationship in ways that sustained the connection, all without the direct feedback that might have told her whether she was succeeding or failing at any particular stage. The opacity of the system protected established social hierarchies by making entry difficult and rejection invisible, which is a design feature rather than an incidental quality. Women who successfully managed upward social movement through the Victorian social network were doing something genuinely demanding. navigating a system that communicated through silence and indirection, that rewarded precise timing and calibrated expression of interest, and that punished both excessive eagerness and insufficient attention with equal efficiency. The calling card was the formal interface of this system, and mastering its protocol was the first requirement for any woman who wanted to move within it rather than simply be placed by it. The role of servants in the calling card system was significant and somewhat uncomfortable, in the way that many aspects of Victorian domestic life involving servants were significant and somewhat uncomfortable. The footman or parlour maid who answered the door and received cards was performing a social function on behalf of the household, assessing callers, receiving cards, delivering the household's social decisions about who was at home and who was not. The servant was, in this role, an extension of the household's social management apparatus. They knew who was expected, they knew who was welcome, and they knew how to handle the cases where the answer was neither a clear yes nor a clear no. A skilled household servant in Victorian England needed considerable social knowledge to perform their role correctly. They needed to know the social geography of the household's connections, to recognise faces and names that might arrive at the door, to manage the tray appropriately, and to deliver the household's social messages, particularly not at home, with a neutral smoothness that did not allow the visitor to read anything more into the delivery than the words themselves conveyed. This required a specific kind of social intelligence that was neither acknowledged nor compensated by the title servant, but that was entirely essential to the functioning of the system. The servant also functioned as a gatekeeper in a more immediate social sense. The households that could afford a well-trained, well-presented servant at the door were communicating something about themselves through that presence. The existence of domestic staff was itself a social signal, and the quality of the staff was a refinement of that signal. A household that answered its own door was a household of a certain economic standing, regardless of what card was left when you arrived. The Victorian calling card system was, in this as in everything else, embedded in material conditions that shaped its social meanings at every level. The entire system began to simplify as the Victorian period moved toward its close. The later decades of the century saw some relaxation of the more elaborate elements of the protocol. The strict timing conventions became somewhat less rigid. The corner-folding vocabulary became less systematically practiced. The number of published guides on the subject began to generate the kind of satirical attention that usually precedes a practice's decline into self-parody. By the Edwardian period, calling cards persisted but with a lighter touch, the full grammatical complexity of the earlier system giving way to something more casual in its application. This is the characteristic pattern for the Victorian social rules we've been examining throughout this series. They reached their peak of elaboration and codification in the middle decades of the century, when the social anxieties that generated them were most acute, and the social aspirations that made compliance rewarding were most energetically pursued, and they began to relax in the final decades as social structures shifted, as women's public lives expanded, and as the enormous cultural investment in social surface management began to encounter more direct challenges. The calling card didn't disappear. Versions of it persisted well into the 20th century, and something like it exists today in the business card, which carries some of the same social function identity communication, contact initiation, network management though without the corner-folding grammar and without the obligation to return it within a socially calibrated interval. The modern business card exchange is, if you think about it, a significantly simplified version of the Victorian calling card ritual, stripped of most of its rules and almost all of its social stakes, which makes it considerably easier to manage and considerably less interesting to analyse. What the calling card system reveals, when examined in full, is the extraordinary amount of social work that Victorian women performed through the medium of paper and timing. The maintenance of a household social network, the calling, the receiving, the returning, the tracking of who owed calls to whom, the management of the at-home day, the curation of the card tray, the calibration of response timing, the encoding and decoding of corner folds and pencil annotations, was a substantial ongoing labour that was conducted almost entirely by women and was almost entirely invisible as labour. It was invisible as labour because it was classified as social activity, rather than worker category error that the Victorian period made with impressive consistency across all the domains of female social management we've been examining. The woman who maintained her household social network through the calling card system was not working, in Victorian understanding. She was participating in social life, which was simply what women of her class did. The fact that participation required continuous effort, specialized knowledge, and real skill was not acknowledged by the category, which is characteristic of how categories function when they are serving ideological purposes rather than descriptive ones. The card on the silver tray looked like a small, pleasant social gesture. What it actually represented was one exchange in an ongoing system of social management that required precision, timing, judgment, and the kind of attention to accumulated social information that would be recognized in a commercial context as a significant professional competency. Running that system, keeping the calls made and returned, the relationships maintained, the social network of the household healthy and active was a genuine job. A job that had no job title, no salary, and no recognition as anything other than the natural social activity of a woman with appropriate breeding and appropriate time. It was done on paper, with bent corners and pencil annotations and carefully calibrated timing, and it worked in the sense that social networks maintained through it were real networks, real relationships, real social power built and managed through the medium of 3 inches of engraved cardboard. Small as it was, the calling card was one of the more honest documents in the Victorian Social Archive. Everything it communicated precisely. All you needed was the codebook and the discipline, the timing, and the social intelligence to use it correctly, which naturally took years to acquire and a lifetime to apply without appearing to apply it at all. Consider the simple act of leaving the house. You decide you want to go somewhere. You put on your coat, open the door, and go. The destination might be a shop, a park, a cafe, a friend's house. The mechanism is the same in every case. You want to go somewhere, so you go. The decision is yours. The timing is yours. The route is yours. Nobody needs to be consulted, nobody needs to accompany you, and nobody, unless you are having a very unusual day, will draw conclusions about your moral character from the fact that you made the journey alone. This is so ordinary that it barely registers as a feature of daily life. It is simply how moving through the world works. For a Victorian woman of the middle or upper classes, it worked entirely differently. Leaving the house was not a simple act of personal decision. It was a social event with prerequisites, and the most fundamental prerequisite was this: she could not go alone. Not to the shop, not to the park, not to a friend's house, unless that friend lived close enough, and the route was appropriate enough, and the time of day was correct enough, and someone could be found to accompany her. The unaccompanied woman in Victorian public space was not simply a woman who had gone out without a companion. She was a social statement, and the statement she was making was not one that a respectable woman wanted to make. The rule against female solo movement in Victorian public life was not, in its basic form, invented by the Victorians. Restrictions on women's freedom of movement in public space have a long history in many cultures and periods, and the specific Victorian version was a development of earlier European practices of female chaperonage and supervised mobility that predated the 19th century by several hundred years. What the Victorian period contributed was the codification, the social enforcement, and characteristically a considerable amount of written commentary explaining why the rule was not only appropriate but morally necessary. The logic ran something like this. A woman in public space was a woman visible to strangers. Strangers, by definition, did not know her. They could not know her social position, her moral character, her family connections, or anything else about her that might allow them to place her correctly in the social landscape. In the absence of this information, a woman's public appearance communicated everything they had to work with, and one of the primary pieces of information it communicated was whether she was accompanied. An accompanied woman had someone with her who vouched, by their presence, for her social legitimacy. Her companion, whether a family member, a servant, or a designated chaperone, was a visible endorsement. This person belongs in the public space she's occupying, on terms that you as a stranger should recognize and respect. An unaccompanied woman provided no such endorsement. She was, in the reasoning of the period, a woman who had stepped outside the social structure that identified and protected her, and whose presence in public space therefore had no clear meaning. Since the only women who regularly appeared in public alone were women whose social position did not require protection specifically, women who worked for a living, women who did not have the domestic arrangements that provided chaperonage, and women whose relationship to respectability was, by the period's classification, Already compromised, an unaccompanied woman was read through that association. She looked, to the strangers evaluating her, like a woman of that category. Whether she actually was or not was, from the street's perspective, undetermined. And in a world where reputation was built from appearances and destroyed by associations, being undetermined was almost as bad as being determined in the wrong direction. The chaperone was the institutional solution to this problem, and the chaperone's role was one of the more peculiar social positions that the Victorian period generated. A chaperone was a companion whose primary function was to make another woman's presence in social space legible, to provide, through her own presence, the endorsement that transformed an ambiguous solo figure into a properly contextualized social person. She was, in the most basic sense, a social annotation. She told observers who the woman she accompanied was, or rather, what category of woman she was, without saying a word. The ideal chaperone for a young unmarried woman was a married or widowed woman of settled social standing, someone old enough and established enough that her own social position was unambiguous and could be extended to cover the woman she accompanied. An aunt, an older married friend, the mother of a social acquaintance, any of these could serve the function. For less formal outings, a trusted and presentable lady's maid could sometimes substitute, particularly for shopping or errands that didn't require the full social endorsement of a proper chaperone. The social weight of a lady's maid was considerably less than that of a genuine chaperone, and the distinction was noticed, but it was sufficient for practical purposes in contexts where the formal chaperonage requirement was somewhat relaxed. What made the chaperone's role genuinely peculiar was its combination of social significance and personal subordination. The chaperone was essential without her, the outing couldn't happen, or happened under conditions of social vulnerability that created real consequences. And yet the chaperone was, in the social dynamic of the outing, firmly secondary. She was present for the other woman's benefit. Her own preferences, comfort and interests were not the organizing principle of the occasion. She was there to make something possible for someone else, which is a role that has a long and distinguished history in various forms of service, and a somewhat more complicated history in terms of how it was experienced by the people performing it. For many women who served as chaperones, the role was accepted as a social obligation. Without particular complaint, it was what married women and aunts did. It was part of the fabric of female social life, and it came with the understanding that they had once been chaperoned themselves, and that the system served purposes they genuinely believed in. For others, particularly those who found themselves serving as permanent or semi-permanent chaperones, without the compensation of their own fully independent social life, the role could be more complicated. The unmarried woman of a certain age who was absorbed into a family as a residential chaperone for younger female relatives was a recognizable Victorian social type, useful, present, largely overlooked, and not necessarily having chosen the position with enthusiasm. The geography of acceptable and unacceptable female movement through Victorian cities was specific enough to have been mapped, at least in practical terms, by the women who navigated it daily. Not every street, not every neighbourhood, not every public space was equal in the degree of social scrutiny it applied to women who moved through it, and understanding these distinctions was a practical requirement for any woman who moved through the city with any regularity. The main shopping streets of respectable commercial districts, the areas where the department stores and the established drapers and milliners conducted their business, were generally understood as legitimate female territory. Women shopping were women engaged in a recognised and approved activity, and their presence in these spaces carried its own social justification, even when accompanied only by a maid or another woman, rather than a full formal chaperone. Shopping was, by the second half of the Victorian period, one of the primary legitimate reasons for a woman of the middle classes to be in public space, and the infrastructure of respectable retail, the department stores that provided tea rooms and rest areas and the general atmosphere of supervised comfort that made them attractive to women of good standing had been partly designed with this function in mind. The park was more complicated. Public parks in Victorian cities served multiple social functions simultaneously, and not all of them were equally respectable. The fashionable promenade, the specific hours, in specific parks, where the respectable classes came to see and be seen, was an entirely legitimate social occasion that required the same careful management of appearance and social presentation that any formal social occasion did, but that was not considered problematic for women to participate in with appropriate company. Hyde Park in London had its specific promenade hours, its recognised circuits, its social geography of who walked where and when. Being present at the right time on the right path, correctly dressed and appropriately accompanied, was a social activity, not a social risk. The same park at a different hour, or a less fashionable park without the social supervision that the promenade provided, was a different matter. Parks in the evening were not appropriate for respectable women. Parks in parts of the city that weren't fashionable were problematic. The park bench occupied alone, without visible purpose or appropriate company, placed the woman sitting on it in an ambiguous social position that was sufficiently uncomfortable to avoid. Public parks were spaces where the social meaning of female presence varied enormously with context, and reading that context correctly was another of the practical navigational skills that Victorian women in cities needed to develop. The cafe and restaurant question deserves specific attention because it illustrates the broader rule with particular clarity, and because it changed significantly over the course of the Victorian period in ways that track the broader shifts in women's public lives. In the early and middle Victorian period, a woman dining alone in a public restaurant or eating establishment was, in most contexts, making herself conspicuous in ways she probably didn't want to be conspicuous. Public eating establishments ranged along a spectrum from the entirely unacceptable at one end to the mildly awkward at the other, but very few of them provided the kind of environment in which a respectable woman alone could eat a meal without attracting the kind of attention that the attending being alone implied. The logic was the same as the logic governing every other kind of solo female public appearance. Without the social endorsement of a companion, her presence in the space communicated an ambiguity about her social position that respectable women preferred not to broadcast. The solution, as the Victorian period progressed and women's public presence became somewhat more normalised, was the development of eating and refreshment establishments specifically designed for female customer spaces that solved the solo woman problem by being, themselves, explicitly respectable female territory. The tea room, which became a fixture of respectable commercial districts in the second half of the century, was the most successful of these, a space where women could take refreshment alone or in small groups, in an environment that was designed to communicate safety and propriety through every element of its decor and clientele. The tea room was, effectively, a chaperonage institution in architectural form, a space whose character endorsed the women who occupied it, in the same way that a human chaperone endorsed the woman she accompanied. The ABC bakeries, the Lyons tea shops, and similar establishments that appeared in the final decades of the Victorian period and expanded through the Edwardian era were the mass-market version of this innovation, providing respectable female-friendly public eating space at a price point that the middle classes could access routinely. Their appearance marks a genuine shift in the social geography of women's public life, the development of legitimate female public space that didn't require a human escort to validate the woman's presence in it. The street itself simply walking through it, as a mode of getting from one place to another, rather than as a social promenade, had its own rules that governed route, time, pace, and comportment. The same streets that were entirely acceptable at noon could be different social territory by late afternoon, and genuinely inadvisable after dark. This was partly about actual safety in the modern sense. Victorian cities had their genuinely dangerous neighbourhoods, and a woman alone in them after dark was facing real risks quite apart from any questions of reputation. But the geography of acceptable female movement extended well beyond the actually dangerous and into the symbolically contaminating, and the two were not always easy to distinguish. Certain streets and areas were associated, in the social geography of Victorian cities, with populations and activities that were incompatible with respectability by proximity. Streets near markets, near certain kinds of entertainment establishments, near the edges of neighbourhoods that shaded from respectable into the uncertain. A woman who chose her routes through these areas was choosing to be read through their associations. The argument was not that she would necessarily be harmed or that she was seeking what those areas provided. It was that being present there communicated that she might be, which was, within the reputation as reality logic of Victorian social life, effectively the same thing. The pace of movement mattered as well, in ways that connected the gaze rules we discussed earlier to the physical experience of the street. A woman who walked with unhurried purposefulness, clearly going somewhere, clearly intending to arrive there, moving at the pace of someone with a destination, and the social legitimacy to be on her way to it, occupied public space differently from a woman who loitered, who paused frequently, who appeared to have no particular destination in mind. The woman moving with purpose was, visually, legible as a woman engaged in appropriate activity. The woman who lingered without obvious purpose was generating questions about why she was there and what she was waiting for, which were questions that respectable women preferred not to generate. This put women in the interesting position of needing to appear purposeful in public space even when they weren't in any particular hurry, which required the same management of appearance and the same calibrated performance of a specific kind of personhood that we've seen at work throughout every other domain of their lives. The street was not a space where the performance could be suspended, because the street was a public space, and public space was always observed. The accompaniment requirements varied with social class in ways that produced their own distinctive landscape. Upper-class women with full domestic establishments had the resources to be accompanied at all times without difficulty. Ladies' maids, footmen, carriages, the whole apparatus of wealth that made appropriate public movement logistically straightforward. The requirement imposed on them was real, but it was supported by the infrastructure of their lives in ways that meant its burden was primarily social rather than practical. For middle-class women, the respectable wives and daughters of professional men, merchants and minor tradespeople, the women who made up the largest portion of the group most subject to these rules, the picture was more complicated. These were women who needed to move through public space to accomplish domestic and social objectives that their lives required, but who did not always have immediate access to the accompaniment that full respectability demanded. The maid who served as an escort for shopping trips was a feature of middle-class households of a certain level of prosperity, but many middle-class households were at exactly the level where the maid existed, but was needed for domestic work, and deploying her as a street escort required a logistical negotiation of household priorities that wasn't always simple. The result was a considerable amount of practical compromise and social management, the company of a neighbour for an errand, the quick mutual accompaniment arrangement between women in the same street who happened to be going in the same direction, the careful timing of solo movement to restrict it to the windows of time, and the stretches of route where a single woman's presence was least ambiguous. Women navigated these negotiations daily, invisibly and without comment, making the compromises that their circumstances required while maintaining the outward presentation that the standards required, or something close enough to it that the gap wasn't noticed by anyone who mattered. Working-class women, who had no realistic option of constant male or chaperone accompaniment, because their lives required them to be in public space to conduct employment and domestic business that could not be delayed until escort was available, occupied an entirely different position in this social landscape. They moved through the city alone, continuously and by necessity, and the social rules that governed middle and upper-class female movements simply did not apply to them in the same way, or rather, applied to them differently, in the sense that their solo presence in public space confirmed the social classifications that those rules were designed to maintain. This is one of the more uncomfortable dimensions of the Victorian chaperonage system. It was, among other things, a class marker. The ability to be accompanied was itself a resource it required having people available who could accompany you, which required the domestic arrangements and social connections that only certain levels of prosperity provided. Women who lacked those arrangements were, by the logic of the system, demonstrating through their visible solo public presence that they lacked them. The system made visible, continuously and publicly, the social distinctions it was designed to enforce. The respectable working woman, the governess, the school teacher, the female clerk in the new department stores, the nurse occupied a particularly complicated position in this landscape. Her work required public movement and often required it alone, on schedules determined by employers rather than by the logic of chaperonage. The social framework had not entirely worked out what to do with women whose employment made the chaperonage requirement practically impossible, and the result was a category of grudging acceptance that applied specific exemptions the governess was understood to be moving through public space in the performance of legitimate employment, and the fact that she was alone was interpreted through that employment frame rather than through the more damaging alternative frames available. This exemption was real but limited and somewhat uncomfortable in its application. The working woman who navigated public space alone was understood to be doing so of necessity rather than by choice, which preserved a version of the respectability logic while acknowledging that its full application was impossible in her circumstances. She was respectable within the constraints of her situation rather than respectable in the unrestricted sense that her wealthier counterparts could claim, which is the kind of distinction that feels reasonable until you examine it, and realise it is essentially respectability on a means-tested basis. The evolution of women's public mobility across the Victorian period is one of the clearer lines of social change visible in retrospect, though it wasn't particularly clear at the time because it moved gradually and unevenly, and produced considerable resistance at every step. The middle of the period saw the rules most rigidly enforced and most comprehensively documented. The etiquette manuals of the 1860s and 1870s are where you find the most detailed treatments of female public movement, its requirements and its hazards. The later decades saw gradual shifts that softened the rules without eliminating them. The bicycle, as mentioned earlier in this series in the context of dress reform, was a significant catalyst for female public mobility. A woman on a bicycle was unaccompanied by definition, since bicycles were single-occupant vehicles, and the logistics of chaperonage by bicycle required a level of athletic symmetry that was not always available. The bicycle also covered distances and reached destinations that made traditional accompaniment arrangements impractical. The response to this was, initially, considerable social discomfort about women cycling without escort, followed by a gradual acceptance as the numbers cycling made the discomfort unsustainable, followed by the quiet revision of the rule to accommodate a practice that had already become established. The growth of female employment in new commercial sectors, the department stores, the expanding clerical economy, the various service occupations that the Victorian economic expansion generated, created similar pressures on the accompaniment requirements through the pure force of practical necessity. Millions of women were moving through public space alone because their livelihoods required it, and the social framework that classified this movement as inherently problematic became increasingly difficult to maintain with a straight face as those millions of women went about their days without obvious incident. The physical experience of Victorian women in public urban space was also shaped by the specific infrastructure of the Victorian city, the streets themselves, the transport options, the spatial organisation of commercial and residential areas in ways that interacted with the social rules to create a specific kind of constrained geography. The omnibus, the horse-drawn public conveyance that was the primary form of mass urban transport in Victorian cities, was, for much of the period, a slightly fraught environment for women of the middle classes, not because it was physically dangerous, but because it was a crowded, mixed-class, unstructured social space in which the normal rules of social interaction were somewhat suspended. Strangers sat in proximity. The social credentials of fellow passengers were unverifiable. The physical proximity required in a full omnibus created the kind of contact that the ordinary rules of respectable female movement were designed to prevent. Women using public transport were navigating public space in its most mixed and least controllable form, which required a specific version of the composed self-management that all public appearance demanded: eyes forward, expression neutral, presence in the space giving no opening for interaction that wasn't invited. The railway created similar dynamics, though in first-class compartments the passenger composition was managed by price in ways that filtered the social landscape somewhat. The mixed-class nature of railway travel remained a point of social anxiety throughout the period, generating considerable written commentary about the proper behaviour of women on trains, the appropriate response to conversation from unknown fellow passengers, and the management of the physical proximity that train travel imposed. What the omnibus and the railway did over time was normalise female solo movement by making it routine and observable. Women moving through the city on public transport, alone, without incident every day, generated a practical reality that gradually undermined the theoretical framework that said such movement was inherently problematic. The framework didn't collapse, it persisted, in modified forms, well beyond the Victorian period. But it became harder to sustain with full credibility as the evidence of everyday female urban life accumulated. The story of the Victorian woman on the street is, ultimately, a story about contested territory, about who had the legitimate right to occupy public space without having that occupation read as a statement about their social position, their moral character, or their relationship to the protection of male accompaniment. The middle and upper-class Victorian woman was, in public space, legible only through the social endorsement she carried with her, the companion who confirmed her respectability, the correct address she was visibly headed toward, the respectable hour at which she was moving, the appropriate district through which her route passed. Strip away any of those endorsements and she became ambiguous. Ambiguous, in the visual grammar of Victorian public space, was a dangerous category for a woman to occupy. The effort required to avoid that ambiguity, to always have the companion, to always choose the route, to always calibrate the timing, to always move with the visible purposefulness that said, "I am here with good reason," and in appropriate circumstances was considerable. It was the street version of the same continuous social performance that governed the drawing room, the dining table, and the calling card tray. The city was an extension of the domestic social world, subject to the same visual reading and the same social consequences for failures of presentation. A woman who navigated it well was invisible, in the best sense. She moved through public space without generating any commentary or any questions, her presence entirely unremarkable, her social positioning entirely legible and entirely correct. The goal was not to be noticed for doing it right. The goal was to not be noticed at all. Which is, when you think about it, a significant amount of work in service of achieving the appearance of doing nothing remarkable whatsoever. There is something deeply human about the impulse to mark death with ceremony, to designate a period of altered behaviour, changed appearance, suspended ordinary life, as an acknowledgement that something significant has happened and that the world cannot simply continue as before. Grief rituals exist in virtually every human culture, and the impulse behind them is recognisable across enormous spans of time and difference. We process loss partly through visible behaviour. We communicate it to others so that they can respond appropriately. We take time. The Victorians took this impulse and organised it into a system of such elaborate precision that grief, one of the most private and individual of human experiences, became, for the middle and upper classes, primarily a public performance with a fixed schedule, specific costuming requirements, and social consequences for deviation. Victorian mourning was not simply the expression of personal sorrow. It was a formal social obligation with stages, durations, rules about which activities were permitted at which stage, and a watching social world that noted whether those rules were being followed with sufficient rigour. Whether the person in mourning was actually experiencing profound grief, or mild sadness, or even quiet relief was largely beside the point. The performance of grief was required regardless of the underlying emotional reality, and the performance had to be correct. In a period that had refined the reading of social surfaces into a fine art, this is perhaps not surprising. What is surprising, when examined in detail, is just how comprehensive the system became. The trigger for the most demanding mourning obligations was the death of a husband, and the requirements placed on a widow were the most extensive and the most precisely calibrated of any mourning scenario. This is worth noting at the outset, because the asymmetry between what was required of widows and what was required of widowers is one of the more vivid illustrations of how differently Victorian society managed the social aftermath of death for men and women. A man who had lost his wife wore a black armband and black accessories for a period that convention set at around 3 months to a year, depending on the closeness of the relationship and the fashion of the decade. He continued his professional and social activities. He returned to public life within a relatively short period. He was not expected to remain in mourning clothing for more than a year in most cases, and the social pressure on him to remarry often from the practical consideration of needing someone to manage his household and children was frequently quite direct. A widower who remarried within a year of his wife's death was not universally applauded, but neither was he facing the kind of social censure that would have been directed at a widow in equivalent circumstances. A widow, by contrast, entered a mourning cycle that, at its most complete form, lasted approximately 2.5 years and progressed through several distinct and precisely defined stages. The first stage, full mourning or deep mourning, as it was called, lasted for approximately 12 months. During this period, the widow's entire wardrobe was black, not navy, not very dark grey, not black with any coloured trim black. The fabric had to be matte rather than shiny. The approved materials were parramatta, a silk and wool blend, and crepe, a distinctive crimped and somewhat scratchy fabric made specifically for mourning purposes and produced in such quantities by the Victorian mourning industry that a single manufacturer, Courtaulds, effectively had a national near monopoly on its production for much of the period. Shiny fabrics, silk, satin, taffeta, were explicitly wrong for deep mourning, because their reflectiveness communicated a lightness of spirit that was inappropriate to the stage. Crepe, which was used to trim the dress, the bonnet, the mantle, and essentially every outer garment during deep mourning, was a fabric with several endearing qualities and one significant drawback: it deteriorated. It was sensitive to moisture, which in the British climate meant it was sensitive to most days that ended in the letter Y. It faded. It became limp. It required careful maintenance to keep it looking as mourning fabric was supposed to look sombre, controlled, undistinguished by any hint of decoration or ornament beyond the crepe itself. The maintenance of a mourning wardrobe in proper condition was, yet again, a substantial practical labour that fell almost entirely on women. After 12 months of full mourning, the widow could transition to second mourning, which lasted approximately 9 months, and permitted some relaxation of the crepe requirements. Plain black could replace heavily trimmed crepe. Black silk, previously forbidden, became acceptable. Some jewellery was now permitted, specifically jet, a black semi-precious stone mined primarily at Whitby on the Yorkshire coast, or vulcanite, a black rubber material that served as a cheaper substitute. Whitby jet had been fashionable mourning jewellery before the Victorian period, but the Victorian mourning industry's appetite for it was extraordinary. So extraordinary that jet mining at Whitby experienced a boom, specifically driven by Victorian mourning demand, employing hundreds of workers at its peak, and generating an industry almost entirely dependent on the continued reliable occurrence of death among the Victorian upper middle class. After second mourning came half mourning, lasting roughly 6 months, in which the colour range expanded to include grey, white, lavender, and mauve, the soft, muted tones that were mourning's transitional zone between full black and the return to ordinary colour. Half mourning produced some of the more unusual fashion phenomena of the period. The carefully calibrated lavender that was dark enough to signal continued grief, but light enough to signal emerging recovery. The grey silk that occupied the exact tonal middle point between mourning and ordinary dress. The women navigating half mourning were, in a very literal sense, wearing their emotional progress on their sleeve, except that the emotional progress was scheduled rather than experienced, which meant that the lavender appeared approximately on cue regardless of whether the transition from grief to something lighter was actually occurring on schedule. The total duration of widow's mourning, approximately 2 years and 3 months at its fullest expression, was not universally followed in every detail by every widow in every decade of the Victorian period. Fashion shifted, individual circumstances varied, some households and some social communities were stricter than others. But the general framework was consistent and widely understood, and deviation from it was noticed. A widow who appeared in society in ordinary coloured dress within a few months of her husband's death was making a visible statement that her social community would interpret, and the interpretation was generally not flattering. Beyond widowhood, the mourning system extended to cover every degree of relationship with its own specified duration. The death of a parent required 12 months of mourning, a sibling 6 months, a grandparent 3 months, an aunt or uncle 6 to 8 weeks, a first cousin 4 weeks. The precision of these intervals is one of those features of the Victorian mourning code that seems almost satirically bureaucratic. In retrospect, the idea that grief for a first cousin should express itself for exactly 4 weeks, after which the obligation expired and normal colour could resume, suggests a relationship between scheduled compliance and emotional experience that has its own particular charm. The logic was not, to be fair, entirely without internal consistency. The mourning schedule was calibrated to social expectation rather than to individual feeling. It reflected how much grief the relationship was understood to warrant in the social sense, how much public expression was owed to the deceased as a mark of respect and family solidarity, rather than making any claim about how the surviving person actually felt. The widow who had genuinely adored her husband, and the widow who had found him profoundly tiresome, were both required to mourn for 2 years, because the social obligation was to the institution of marriage and to the public acknowledgement of loss rather than to the authentic measurement of personal grief. Whether this was a comfort or an additional burden to anyone in particular depended very much on the individual circumstances. For a woman who was genuinely devastated by loss, the rigid external structure of mourning provided a framework that organized the social expression of grief in ways that may have been useful. For a woman who was not devastated, the requirement to sustain the performance of devastation for 2 years in crepe and jet jewellery was a significant additional demand on top of whatever she was actually experiencing. The social restrictions that accompanied mourning dress were, if anything, even more comprehensive than the dress requirements themselves. During full mourning, a widow was expected to withdraw from social entertainment essentially completely. Balls, concerts, the theatre, dinner parties, any occasion that could be categorised as entertainment or festivity, these were suspended. Calls could be paid and received, but only with appropriate solemnity and within the limits of what deep mourning permitted. The widow was, in social terms, temporarily removed from full participation in the world she had occupied before her husband's death. The rationale was that entertainment and public social life were expressions of a lightness of spirit incompatible with deep mourning. A widow seen at a ball in the first 3 months after her husband's death was communicating in the clearest possible terms that her grief was insufficient, that the social obligation to her husband's memory was less important to her than her own pleasure. The social community's response to this communication was correspondingly sharp. The widow who failed to perform her mourning correctly was not merely violating a fashion convention. She was being publicly indecent towards someone who could no longer defend their own honour, which placed her in a moral category that Victorian society was not inclined to treat gently. The gradual return to social life over the stages of mourning was itself choreographed. Second mourning permitted a cautious re-emergence, limited social calls, small gatherings rather than large public occasions, a measured increase in social participation that tracked the approved emotional arc from acute grief toward recovery. Half mourning expanded this further. The return to full social participation coincided broadly with the return to full ordinary dress, so that the visible signal of completed mourning and the social reintegration were synchronized. The Victorian mourning industry that grew up to serve these requirements was, by the mid-century, a substantial commercial enterprise that had found a genuinely captive market in the most literal sense. People died, mourning was mandatory, and the rules required specific products that could not easily be substituted. Dedicated mourning warehouses, the most famous of which, Jay's London General Mourning Warehouse in Regent Street, occupied an entire large building and stocked everything from funeral crepe to jet jewellery to mourning stationery, provided a one-stop experience for the bereaved household that needed to equip itself for grief with appropriate efficiency. The economics of mourning were not trivial. A complete widow's mourning wardrobe at full specification involved a considerable quantity of specialised fabric, multiple complete changes of costume for different times of day, and different types of occasion, accessories, jewellery, and the various smaller items, mourning handkerchiefs, mourning writing paper with its characteristic black border, mourning sealing wax that accompanied the larger wardrobe items. The total outlay could be significant, which created the uncomfortable situation that inadequate mourning dress communicated not only insufficient grief, but potentially insufficient resources. A widow who appeared in mourning that fell short of the standard might be grieving adequately, but displaying simultaneously that the household could not fully afford the appropriate expression of that grief. The mourning industry was not unaware of this dynamic, and responded to it with the commercial creativity that the Victorian economy generally brought to social anxieties. Ready-made mourning garments at various price points, rental arrangements for mourning dress, second-hand mourning clothing markets, all of these existed and served women who needed to achieve the visual standard without the expenditure of a full custom wardrobe. Whether this represented genuine democratization of the mourning system, or simply the extension of its social pressures to people who could barely afford to meet them, is a question with an obvious answer. The mourning code for children's clothing introduced its own particular dimension of the system. Children in households in mourning wore mourning dress scaled to their ages and to the degree of relationship to the deceased. Small children in full black crepe, in the images that the Victorian photographic tradition has preserved, present a visual that strikes modern eyes with considerable force, partly because of the strangeness of full formal mourning on very young children, and partly because Victorian childhood photographs already have a certain gravity to them that the mourning dress amplifies considerably. Children were dressed in mourning because they were part of the household, and the household's public presentation included all its visible members. The logic was consistent with everything else in the Victorian mourning system. The social obligation was collective, not individual, and the household's expression of appropriate grief had to be visible across all the people who represented it in public. A household whose children were observed in bright clothing while the family was formally in mourning would have attracted exactly the kind of social commentary that the household was trying to avoid. What is perhaps most striking about the Victorian mourning system viewed from the present is the degree to which it converted the most intimate of human experiences into public performance, and specifically into performance that was more demanding for women than for men, more visible, more extended, more expensive, and more consequential if done incorrectly. The asymmetry between what was required of widows and what was required of widowers is not incidental. It is the mourning code's clearest expression of the broader principle that has appeared throughout every aspect of Victorian women's lives that we've examined. The social surface was a woman's primary obligation, its maintenance her primary responsibility, and its failure her primary vulnerability. The grief itself was private. The performance of grief was public, scheduled, and subject to social judgment with real consequences. The woman who navigated this correctly, who wore the right fabric at the right stage, who withdrew from and returned to social life on the appropriate timeline, who expressed the appropriate degree of solemnity without sliding into a display of grief so prolonged that it raised different questions about her mental stability, was doing something that required sustained skill and constant management through what was often genuinely a difficult period of her life. That she did this without complaint, in most documented cases, and that the system was maintained by the collective compliance of millions of women across 6 decades, tells us something important about how social systems sustain themselves. Not through external enforcement alone, there were no mourning police, but through the internalization of their logic by the very people whose compliance made them function. The Victorian mourning code worked because Victorian women made it work, because the social consequences of not complying were real, and because the values that underpin the system were, for many of them, genuinely held. The scheduled grief was real grief for many of the women who performed it. The two things coexisted, as they usually do. Every effective social control system needs a legitimate authority to provide it with the appearance of objective necessity. Political systems use law. Religious systems use divine mandate. The Victorian system of female behavioural control had, in addition to both of these, something that the 19th century regarded with particular reverence and particular credulity: science, specifically medicine. Specifically, a medical profession that was almost entirely male, that was developing professional authority and institutional prestige at exactly the moment when questions about women's social roles were becoming most contested, and that proved, with impressive consistency, to find scientific justification for precisely the social arrangements that already existed. This is not a coincidence. It is in fact one of the more instructive examples in the historical record of how scientific-sounding authority gets mobilized in service of social conclusions that were reached before any data was collected. Victorian medicine's relationship to women was complex in ways that require some care to describe accurately, because the full picture is not simply one of malicious conspiracy. Many Victorian physicians genuinely believed the theories they published about female physiology. They were working within a framework of understanding about biology, health, and human nature that was the best available framework of their time, and that contained, alongside its significant errors, some genuine advances in understanding. The problem was not that they were bad scientists by the standards of their age, though some of them were. The problem was that they were scientists embedded in a culture with strong prior commitments about what women were and what women should be, and that these prior commitments shaped what questions got asked, what results were considered plausible, and what conclusions got published, in ways that were largely invisible to the people involved. The foundational assumption of Victorian medical thinking about women was the doctrine of the economy of vital force, the idea, derived from a combination of earlier physiological theories and the broader Victorian fascination with energy and efficiency, that the Industrial Revolution had installed at the centre of cultural thinking, that the human body had a fixed quantity of vital energy available to it, and that energy spent on one function was unavailable for others. This theory was applied to both sexes, but its implications were developed with particular enthusiasm in relation to women. The reasoning ran as follows. Women's bodies were primarily organized around their reproductive function. The capacity for reproduction was the central biological purpose of the female organism, and the vital energy required to maintain and exercise that capacity was substantial. Any significant diversion of vital energy toward other functions, intellectual activity, physical exertion, emotional stress, public engagement necessarily came at the expense of the reproductive system's proper maintenance. A woman who exerted her mental capacities strenuously was, therefore, diverting vital energy from her reproductive organs with predictable consequences for her fertility, her hormonal equilibrium, and her general health. This theory explained, with the satisfying logic of the internally consistent but empirically groundless, why women shouldn't be educated too intensively. It explained why women shouldn't undertake strenuous physical activity. It explained why women shouldn't participate in the emotionally demanding world of politics and public life. It explained, in short, almost every restriction on women's activities that Victorian society had already decided was appropriate, in language that sounded scientific and that could therefore be deployed in debates about women's education and employment with an authority that we simply prefer it this way could not have claimed. The most prominent champion of this framework in the Victorian period was not a fringe figure but a respected physician, whose work was taken seriously in both the medical establishment and the broader public. Edward H. Clarke, an American physician whose 1873 book Sex and Education argued that intensive academic study during adolescence damaged the female reproductive system, found an enthusiastic British audience that welcomed his arguments as scientific confirmation of existing social preferences. Clarke's book was widely read, widely cited, and widely used in arguments against women's higher education arguments that could now appeal to medical authority rather than simply to conventional preference. Clarke's methodology would not survive modern scrutiny. His sample was small, his controls were non-existent, and his conclusions preceded his evidence with a directness that suggests the evidence was assembled to support the conclusion rather than the other way around. But his work was published at a moment when the scientific profession's reputation for objectivity was high, and when the tools for evaluating statistical claims were not yet widely distributed, which meant that a physician saying intensive study harms women was heard by many audiences as an objective medical finding rather than as a socially motivated argument in scientific dress. The response from women educators and physicians who disagreed with Clarke was immediate, substantive, and largely ignored by the cultural mainstream, which is a pattern that appears repeatedly in the history of scientific claims that serve existing power arrangements. The counter-evidence, the data from women's colleges showing that intensively educated women were not collapsing in reproductive dysfunction, accumulated over decades and eventually proved decisive. But the process was slow precisely because the theory was convenient for the people who held institutional power over educational policy. The diagnosis of hysteria deserves its own careful examination, because it is one of the more revealing examples of medical category construction in the service of social control, and because it has been both oversimplified and underexplained in popular accounts. Hysteria, as a medical category, was ancient. The word derives from the Greek for uterus, and theories connecting a range of female symptoms to the uterus and its behaviour date back to antiquity. By the Victorian period, hysteria had accumulated an extraordinary range of symptoms under its diagnostic umbrella: fainting, convulsions, paralysis, blindness, deafness, excessive emotion, inappropriate emotion, insufficient emotion, and virtually any other presentation that a physician found difficult to explain through other means. It was in effect a category for what medicine didn't understand, and in the 19th century, medicine didn't understand a great deal. What was specifically Victorian about hysteria was the way it got deployed in relation to female behaviour that the social system found inconvenient. The hysterical woman was, in Victorian medical understanding, a woman whose nervous system had been destabilised by excessive emotion, by intellectual overexertion, by the various strains of modern life, by any number of causes that conveniently included most of the activities that women were already discouraged from pursuing, and the treatment for hysteria was naturally rest, withdrawal from stimulation, reduction of activity, the cessation of whatever the woman had been doing when her symptoms appeared. The circular logic here is worth pausing on. A woman who exhibited symptoms of what we would now recognise as anxiety, depression, or any of a range of neurological conditions received a diagnosis whose primary treatment was to stop whatever she was doing that might have been providing her with purpose, autonomy, or intellectual engagement, and then her compliance with this treatment was taken as evidence that it was working, because she was no longer doing the things that the medical establishment had told her were harming her. The diagnostic category, the treatment, and the measure of success were all oriented in the same direction, toward the reduction of female activity and the reinforcement of domesticity and dependence. The physician who told a woman she was hysterical and needed rest was not necessarily being dishonest. He may have genuinely believed that what he was seeing was nervous system dysfunction, and that rest was the appropriate response. But he was working within a framework that pre-classified certain kinds of female behavior as pathological, that saw independence, intellectual engagement, and strong emotion as symptoms rather than as ordinary human characteristics, and that framework shaped his perception in ways that made the diagnosis self-confirming. The specific treatment for hysteria that has attracted the most commentary in the years since is the rest cure, developed and popularized by the American neurologist Silas Weir Mitchell in the 1870s, and applied extensively to women in both American and British medical practice through the final decades of the century. Mitchell's rest cure was, by modern standards, a treatment of remarkable severity. The patient was confined to bed for weeks or months, denied all activity including reading and writing and sometimes even conversation, fed a diet designed to restore weight, and subjected to massage and electrical stimulation administered by nurses under the physician's direction. The goal was the complete removal of all stimulation and all independent activity, allowing the nervous system to recover through enforced passivity. The rest cure's most famous patient was the American writer Charlotte Perkins Gilman, who received it in the late 1880s and whose short story, The Yellow Wallpaper, a first-person account of a woman's mental deterioration under a rest cure imposed by her physician husband, stands as one of the most precisely observed documents of what the treatment felt like from the inside. Gilman eventually rejected the treatment and recovered her health by returning to the intellectual and creative work that the rest cure had forbidden. Her recovery under exactly the conditions the rest cure prescribed against was not, apparently, cause for medical reflection on the theory's validity. Mitchell himself, to his credit, eventually acknowledged the possibility that the treatment was not universally beneficial. The medical establishment's relationship to the rest cure was more complicated than simple endorsement. There were physicians throughout the period who questioned its efficacy and its rationale, but it remained in use for decades and was applied to substantial numbers of women before the theory behind it gradually lost credibility in the early 20th century. The category of neurasthenia nervous exhaustion served similar social functions to hysteria, but with a slightly different social coding. Where hysteria was associated primarily with emotion and the female reproductive system, neurasthenia was a more general diagnosis of nervous depletion, available to both sexes, though its application to women followed the same pattern of identifying autonomous activity as the cause and enforced passivity as the cure. A woman who was attempting to pursue employment, education, or any kind of sustained public engagement, and who exhibited any symptoms of tiredness, anxiety, or difficulty, which is to say, a woman who was attempting to do demanding things while also managing the considerable demands of Victorian domestic and social life, was a candidate for neurasthenia. The treatment was, again, rest, withdrawal, the cessation of the activity that had apparently caused the problem. The physician was, in effect, prescribing the existing social arrangement as medicine, recommending that women return to the domestic and dependent role that the social system expected of them, with the authority of medical diagnosis behind the recommendation. Whether the woman found this helpful depended very much on whether the activity she was being told to stop was the source of her difficulty or one of the things sustaining her. Not all Victorian physicians were complicit in this framework, and the history of Victorian medicine and women is not only a story of social control. There were women who entered the medical profession in the Victorian period against enormous resistance, and whose perspective on women's health was, unsurprisingly, somewhat different from that of their male colleagues. Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, who became the first woman to qualify as a physician in Britain in 1865, after navigating a process that involved legal challenges, institutional obstruction, and the creative exploitation of a loophole in the Society of Apothecaries regulations, went on to establish the New Hospital for Women in London in 1872, the first hospital in Britain staffed entirely by women, offering medical care to women from women who were less likely to reach for the hysteria diagnosis at the first sign of inconvenient behaviour. The London School of Medicine for Women, which Garrett Anderson helped found in 1874, created a pathway for women's medical education that didn't depend on the existing institution's willingness to admit them, which was, by this point, clearly not forthcoming. The school's graduates entered practice with a medical education equivalent to their male counterparts, and with a clinical perspective shaped by their own experience as women navigating a medical system that had generally not been designed with their interests in mind. The women physicians who emerged from this tradition were, in many cases, explicit about their critique of the medical frameworks that had been applied to women. They published counter-arguments to the vital force theory, to the rest cure, to the educational harms argument. They collected data on female students and graduates that directly contradicted the theoretical predictions. They were practicing what we would now call evidence-based medicine in the very specific context of correcting evidence-free medical misogyny, which was a more specialized application of the scientific method than most of their training had specified. Their work didn't immediately transform the medical mainstream. Institutional change is always slower than the evidence that should produce it, but it contributed to the accumulation of counter-evidence and counter-argument that gradually made the old frameworks untenable, and it established a tradition of women's medicine that survived and developed through the following century. The pharmaceutical dimension of Victorian women's medical experience is worth a brief mention because it adds another layer to the picture of medicine as a tool of management. The Victorian period saw the widespread availability of patent medicines and proprietary remedies that were marketed specifically to women and that contained as active ingredients a range of substances including alcohol, opium derivatives, and chloral hydrate. Soothing preparations for female complaints, remedies for nervous trouble, tonics for exhaustion. These products were legally available, widely marketed, and consumed in very large quantities by women across the social spectrum. The medical establishment's attitude to these products was mixed. Some physicians recommended specific preparations, others were skeptical, others were simply unaware of what their patients were self-medicating with. The social function of these preparations was, in some cases, to manage the symptoms of exactly the conditions that the rest cure and the medical framework had failed to address specifically: the anxiety, depression, and general difficulty of living a highly constrained life with limited recourse to the sources of purpose and autonomy that seem, on the evidence, to be fairly important to human well-being. Whether this represents a story of exploitation, of coping, or of both simultaneously is a question that the period itself was not in a position to ask, since the relationship between the social environment and the mental health of the people living in it was not a medical framework that Victorian medicine had yet developed. We have spent the previous 11 chapters inside a system examining its mechanics, its logic, its reach into every domain of women's lives. We've seen how it worked at the level of fabric and corset bone, at the level of corner-folded calling cards, at the level of medical diagnosis and mourning schedule. We've seen how comprehensively it organized the visible surfaces of women's existence and how consistently it conflated those surfaces with the underlying reality. What we haven't yet examined fully is what happened underneath all of it. Because the system was never as complete as it appeared from the outside, and the women inside it were never simply subjects of its management. They were also, continuously, navigating it, and in many cases, actively working against it through methods that were as creative and as precisely calibrated as the system itself. The resistance to Victorian constraints on women's lives took many forms, operating at many different levels of explicitness and risk. At one end of the spectrum were the overt public movements, the campaigns for women's suffrage, the campaigns for women's education and professional access, the reform movements that argued directly and publicly for changes to the legal, political, and social framework that governed women's lives. These are the resistance stories that history has preserved most completely, because they generated documents and organizations and figures who left records, and whose impact was visible and measurable. But beneath and alongside these public movements was a much larger landscape of private resistance, daily negotiation, and quiet subversion that left fewer formal records and has consequently been somewhat less studied, though not entirely unstudied, because women's letters, diaries, and personal papers have been preserved in considerable numbers, and they tell a rich and specific story about how women inside the system found ways to live that the system hadn't entirely authorized. The letter, for instance, was a medium that the Victorian period simultaneously normalized and underestimated. Writing letters was one of the approved female activities, domestic, private, relational, not a public assertion of opinion or a professional claim, but the ordinary social maintenance of personal connections. Women wrote letters constantly. They wrote to family members, to friends, to social acquaintances, to people they had never met but who shared their interests, to editors of journals, to public figures whose work they admired or disagreed with. The letter was a space in which women expressed views, developed arguments, built intellectual relationships, and participated in the exchange of ideas with a directness that their public social lives rarely permitted. The correspondence networks that some Victorian women maintained were, in effect, intellectual communities, groups of women who thought carefully about politics, literature, philosophy, science, and social organisation, and who exchanged those thoughts in writing with a sophistication that the official narrative about female intellectual capacity would not have predicted. These networks were often invisible to the broader public world, conducted in the domestic medium of private correspondence rather than in the public medium of published argument, which is partly why they have been less studied, since the domestic medium was less valued by the historians who came later. The salon, or its various British equivalents, provided another space in which women could operate with rather more latitude than the public world offered. The private gathering at a woman's home, hosted by the woman herself, allowed for conversations and connections that formal social occasions didn't accommodate. A woman who hosted an intellectually engaged circle of friends was not, technically, participating in public intellectual life. She was entertaining, which was thoroughly approved. But the conversations that happened at these gatherings could be, and often were, substantive, engaging with exactly the political, scientific and social questions that polite mixed company at a formal dinner was supposed to avoid. The intellectual salon was a tradition with roots well before the Victorian period, and the Victorian version ranged from relatively modest domestic gatherings to more ambitious enterprises that hosted significant public figures and served as real nodes in the networks through which ideas circulated. The women who ran these circles were exercising genuine intellectual and social influence through a channel that the social system had left inadequately supervised, because it was categorized as domestic entertaining rather than as the public intellectual activity that it functionally was. The question of female authorship in the Victorian period illustrates the navigation between system and resistance with particular clarity. Writing and publishing were, by the middle of the century, activities that women engaged in at scale. The Victorian novel's central figures include a remarkable number of women, and the periodical press employed women writers in considerable numbers, often under pseudonyms or editorial anonymity. But the path to publication was shaped by the same social framework that governed everything else, and the strategies women used to navigate it reveal a great deal about how creative work and social compliance were managed simultaneously. The pseudonym was perhaps the most significant navigational tool available to Victorian women writers. Writing under a male or gender-neutral pen name allowed a woman to have her work evaluated on its merits, rather than filtered through the assumptions about female intellectual capacity that the period applied to work known to be by women. The Bronte sisters published under the names Currer, Ellis and Acton Bell, names that concealed gender, without making an explicit false claim about it, and the early reception of their work suggests the strategy had its intended effect. Work that reached readers as the production of male or unknown gender authors was, in several documented cases, assessed differently once the author's identity became known, which is one of the more elegantly controlled natural experiments in the history of gendered reception that the period provides. George Eliot, the pen name of Mary Ann Evans, took a similar approach and with similar results. The early Eliot novels were reviewed as the work of a male author, and the reviews were accordingly enthusiastic. The revelation of the author's identity did not destroy her reputation, but it changed the terms of the critical conversation in ways that made the effect of the pseudonym's removal visible. Eliot went on to become one of the most seriously considered novelists in the English language. The disguise was eventually unnecessary, because the work was undeniable. But the disguise got the work into the conversation in the first place. The category of amateur was another navigational tool that Victorian women used with considerable ingenuity. In a society that was officially sceptical of women's professional ambitions, and that provided very limited formal channels for professional female activity, the amateur pursued exactly the same activities, but framed them as personal interest rather than professional aspiration. The woman who was deeply knowledgeable about botany was pursuing a hobby. The woman who wrote music was an accomplished domestic musician. The woman who produced detailed natural history illustrations was engaged in improving pastimes. The work itself might be indistinguishable from professional work in every material respect, but its categorization as amateur removed it from the domain of the professional, and placed it in the domain of the personal, where it attracted less institutional resistance. Some women used this categorization strategically, doing genuine professional quality work under the cover of amateur domesticity, while building networks, reputations, and bodies of work that would eventually be recognized as what they actually were. Beatrix Potter's natural history illustrations, which she produced at a professional standard and attempted to submit to the Linnean Society, which declined to hear her work directly because she was a woman, are one of the more well-documented examples. Her eventual career as a writer and illustrator worked in different channels, but drew on the same combination of genuine skill, strategic navigation of available pathways, and willingness to work within the system's constraints, while building towards something the system hadn't planned for. The suffrage movement, which grew from small organised groups in the 1860s into a national campaign by the end of the century and an international movement by the Edwardian period, was the most direct and the most politically ambitious form of resistance to the Victorian framework. Its methods ranged from the thoroughly respectable petitions, public lectures, published arguments to the increasingly militant, as the campaign's frustration with the pace of change generated the more confrontational tactics of the Edwardian suffragettes. But its intellectual roots were planted in the Victorian period by women who had absorbed the full weight of the social system we've been examining, and who had decided, collectively and individually, that absorbing it was no longer sufficient. The arguments developed in the Victorian suffrage movement drew directly on the contradictions visible throughout the period's social arrangement. If women were moral beings capable of making the sophisticated social and ethical judgments that Victorian domestic ideology attributed to them, why were they excluded from political judgment? If women were capable of managing households, educating children, and navigating the complex social obligations of Victorian middle and upper-class life, why were they considered incapable of casting a vote? The Victorian celebration of feminine moral virtue was turned, by suffrage advocates, into an argument for female political participation, precisely because that virtue, combined with women's specific experience of the system's effects, made them necessary voices in the political process. This argument was not universally accepted, and its progress was slow. But it was strategically sophisticated in exactly the way that Victorian women's resistance tended to be sophisticated. It worked with the materials available, found the leverage inside the existing framework, and used the system's own stated values as evidence for the case against the system's actual practices. The legacy of all of this, the fan vocabulary and the strategic feint, the letter networks and the pseudonyms, the tea rooms and the bicycle rides, the women physicians and the suffrage petitions, is not primarily a museum exhibit. It is the lived present. The freedoms that contemporary women navigate in everyday life without particular conscious attention are the destinations that the resistance produced, accumulated over generations at real personal cost to the women who paid it. The woman who walks down a street alone today, without managing a gaze code or calculating whether her route is socially appropriate, is walking a street that generations of women made navigable by doing it anyway, by insisting on doing it, by suffering the social consequences and continuing. The woman who eats what she wants at a table without calibrating the moral message of her appetite is benefiting from the gradual collapse of a system that made eating into a character examination, a collapse that happened partly because enough women decided that the examination was not theirs to pass. The woman who works in a profession, any profession, without having to disguise the work as a hobby or frame the ambition as something more socially acceptable, is occupying a space that was created deliberately, effortfully, through direct institutional challenge by women who were told they were unsuited to it, and who demonstrated in every case that they were not. None of this happened automatically. None of it was the inevitable outcome of historical forces moving in a predetermined direction. It happened because people worked for it, argued for it, sometimes suffered for it, and built on what previous generations had built toward a destination that none of them would live to occupy fully. That is what change actually looks like from the inside. Not dramatic revolution, but accumulated pressure, sustained over time, by people who understood both the weight of what they were pushing against and the importance of pushing anyway. The Victorian women whose lives we've been examining were not, in the main, heroic figures in the conventional sense. They were people navigating the world they had been given, making the choices available to them, sometimes accepting constraints they found oppressive and sometimes finding ways around them with ingenuity and considerable nerve. They managed their appearances and their gazes and their calling cards and their grief schedules and their medical diagnoses with the competence that surviving in a demanding system requires. And in the spaces the system hadn't thought to close, they did other things. They wrote and organised and corresponded and argued and refused and built. What they built is still standing. The freedoms that feel ordinary are ordinary because they made them ordinary, brick by brick, over a very long time. The emerald boots hidden beneath a 12-kilogram skirt, the small, private defiance that no one outside the room would ever know about matter because they were real, because the impulse behind them was real, because the distance between that hidden pair of boots and a woman walking wherever she wants in whatever she wants is not an abstract historical arc. It is a series of individual choices made by actual people who decided, one by one and then together, that the system's rules were not the final word. They were right about that, and that is a legacy worth knowing. Sweet dreams.